What is it that people and government and the public sector need to know about digital transformation? That's what we're going to cover here in episode 228 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 228. This is the government digital transformation episode. We're going to cover everything related to the tech agnostic side of digital transformation, as we do every week in this podcast. We'll cover the strategy, people, process, and technology sides of change. But in this episode, we're going to focus explicitly on government. And we're going to talk about government in the public sector, whether you're in higher ed, you work for a state, federal, city, or international government agency. Perhaps you work for a nonprofit or other government, pseudo-government sort of organization. We're here to chat about government digital transformations here in episode number 228. Very excited for this episode. We've got a lot to cover. It's going to be an epic episode. And I encourage you to share this episode with other team members, especially if you are in the government space here going through digital transformation or thinking about a digital transformation. We've got a lot to cover today. We're going to talk about the Pentagon's, which, if you don't know, the Pentagon, by the way, is the U.S. Department of Defense, or a part of the Department of Defense, and the Pentagon's $11 billion IT modernization struggles. We'll talk about cost overruns, delays, cybersecurity gaps, and other issues that they're having with their project. We'll talk a bit about how Babson College is going all in on AI. They're using AI first in sort of their approach to education and how they run the university. And then later in the show, we're going to get into a panel discussion where we unpack a massive government failure. We're going to talk about SAAQ, which is the Auto Insurance Board in Quebec, Canada. They recently just had a $1.1 billion SAP failure. And we're going to talk about some of the lessons there. And the great thing about this is we're going to have a panel of experts looking at this case and analyzing the case from several different lenses. We're going to talk about we have someone who's actually a government CIO who will be on the panel. We have an attorney, a software attorney that'll be on the panel. We have an industry analyst, and we have an expert witness from the Third Stage Consulting team who does expert witness testimony and project recovery work for failed projects. So it's going to be a great conversation. I encourage you to listen in on that. And even if you're not in the public sector, there's some really good lessons from that case. And then later in the show, we'll have another guest on who's actually one of the panelists in the first interview segment. He's going to come back and join us again to have a deeper dive discussion from a CIO perspective, some of the lessons learned he has from having led ERP implementations and IT modernization efforts at government entities now for about 25 years. So we're going to pick his brain and get to know what it takes to be successful in these sorts of projects. So a lot of good stuff to cover here today. So really excited. So let's jump into the Pentagon, this $11 billion IT modernization effort that isn't going so well. That's the big takeaway here. And what I want to do is, first of all, I'll show you the article here. This is from CIO Magazine. It was recently published, and there's a number of issues that came from this case here. It's an $11 billion IT modernization effort. There are major cost overruns, significant schedule delays, persistent cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and it's called the Joint Warfighting Cloud Capability Project. So it's JWCC is sort of the overarching transformation name, the way they branded it. And JWCC is meant to replace the failed JEDI contract, which was another effort that the Pentagon was going through. And originally, JWCC was supposed to be a clean, competitive improvement. Now it's showing signs of similar challenges that they had with the previous JEDI project. There's poor vendor coordination, complex procurement requirements, unclear ownership of outcomes, and this multi-vendor approach that they're taking, which if you don't follow it, they've got multiple vendors in there working on the project or supporting the project. You've got AWS, Microsoft, Google, and Oracle, among others. And that whole multi-vendor approach is proving to be a lot more complicated than expected. And on the one hand, they are going through this process with multiple vendors to avoid vendor lock-in and give themselves more flexibility, which on the surface makes a lot of sense. But they may have taken that pendulum or that continuum too far on the spectrum of what you want between total vendor lock-in and total flexibility with a bunch of different vendors. Sounds like they may have swung the pendulum too far towards multiple vendors. And that has really slowed things down for them and has caused a lot of these time overruns and budgetary overruns in terms of interoperability issues between systems, confusion over who's responsible for what. And it's also highlighting cultural resistance inside the Department of Defense to shifting from legacy systems. Anytime you've got well-entrenched legacy systems like a lot of government entities do, you're going to run into resistance to change. And it's not even just people resistance, it's also operational resistance. Your processes are so well baked and so entrenched in the organization. You're not only trying to change the processes, you're also trying to change the people, which can be very difficult. We also see in this case that cybersecurity concerns are stacking up. The audit found gaps in security protocols, insufficient zero trust architecture, and delayed implementation of the controls that were required. And that's not really ideal when national defense is at stake. Obviously, of all people and organizations throughout the world, I would imagine militaries and departments of defense are the ones that have the most to gain or lose by ensuring they've got cybersecurity. So pretty big deal there. And then a sort of another final point here that jumps out as we look in this article is that the Pentagon seemed to have underestimated the complexity of change. They didn't have, experts in the article, and experts that have publicly spoken about this case have identified lack of change management planning as an issue, and underskilled internal staff, and inflexible governance structures, among others that were the big issue there. So those are some of the big takeaways there. And I suppose it really leads to a bunch of other questions here. So when we think about government modernization failures like this one, now, of course, this is a bigger one compared to most, as is the other case study we'll get into here in today's episode. But one of the questions becomes why modernization efforts in government so often run into budget and timeline issues. And first of all, I'd say that that's true in private and public sector. I don't think it really matters. You're going to have that challenge either way, but I would agree that the challenges are bigger with public sector entities, largely because they're in some ways a lot more complex than the average company that produces a tangible product. In government and the public sector, you typically are not producing a tangible product, or at the very least, you've got multiple functions that are very complex and sometimes unrelated that you're trying to manage. So it can make it a lot more difficult to implement a single system or even a single program. When I say program, I mean overall transformation program that can identify the needs of all those different parts of the organization. So that's one part of it, is that the complexity of government organizations is difficult. The political nature of government organizations, of course, they're political. They're governments. So there's going to be politics involved. There's going to be competing, in some cases, conflicting interests, and that again is a purpose of government, especially some of the more the more democratic sorts of governments. You're going to have multiple points of view that can make it difficult to get internal alignment and focus. And then, of course, there's also the fact that government is a little further behind in their modernization efforts. A lot of times they're coming from an old legacy system, iSeries or mainframe, AS400, whatever the case may be, and they're making a huge jump from these really old technologies to these really modern technologies. And that jump is even bigger than what a private sector might have to go through, or a private sector organization might have to go through if they're moving from, say, a 20-year-old ERP system to a modern ERP system. That's a big jump, but not nearly as big as a jump as a public sector organization that's going from a mainframe built in the 70s to a modern ERP system, fast forward, 50 years later. So that's one thing, is as far as why modernization efforts can be so difficult in government. And I think another thing too that oftentimes doesn't get discussed is that government entities are a lot more likely to have super complex and tight procurement processes, which there's a reason for that. I mean, they've got to control what they're spending and control scope, control their vendors. So on the surface, it all sounds good, but what ends up happening a lot of times is those procurement efforts and the overzealous procurement efforts, especially, those can lead to backfiring. Those can backfire into problems. So you think about something like, when we work in the public sector, we're more likely to see a request or a demand for fixed bid projects. And the idea is, if you give a government entity a fixed bid proposal to replace their systems, they feel as though they're managing their risk and their cost. On the surface, yeah, sort of. But when you get into it, what happens is you get change ordered to death. So yes, we created this fixed bid proposal, but one of two things ends up happening when inevitably that fixed bid proposal or that fixed bid contract becomes strained, which it will become strained because fixed bid is very difficult to do in any organization, but especially a large government entity. When they get into the complexities of the business and start to realize, the trouble making decisions and all that stuff is going to slow the project down, they will change order the project to death, or they'll deliver the bare minimum just to get through the fixed bid project and preserve their margins. So I think that's another sort of underrated challenge that government and public sector organizations are more likely to have than in the public sector. And then another issue here is the multi-vendor strategy backfiring? That's an interesting question that comes up from this article. And I would say, yeah, it sounds like it is. I mean, it sounds like they may have taken the multi-vendor approach too far. It's creating operability issues, creating a lot of finger pointing or lack of accountability. So that it sounds like they've created too complex of an architecture when, maybe one single system and one single vendor isn't the right answer, but there's got to be a better way to balance the multi-vendor strategy. If anything, they need a stronger PMO to manage the overall program with all these different parties. They need better integration, and that goes back to the PMO side of it. So that's one part of it. And I'd be curious to hear from the audience here. What do you think about this multi-vendor strategy? Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think organizations in government or even in the private sector, should organizations be pursuing this multi-vendor strategy? Is it a bad idea? What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear that in the chat below. And I'd also love to hear your feedback on why you think IT modernization efforts in government so often run into budget and timeline issues. What are some of the biggest issues you've seen? Love to hear comments in the chat. And we'll pull some of those questions here for future episodes and future discussion. So please drop that in the chat. I'd love to hear it there. We'll also have managing complexity is difficult. There's some big hurdles here between managing 4 different cloud vendors, as I suggested or mentioned before. Legacy infrastructure is deeply embedded within the culture. We talked about that as well. And, the other issue here is leadership. Is this a leadership issue that might be a problem here? And that's something we see often with government entities. There's so many people involved and so many stakeholders that there's no clear owner. There's no clear accountability in many cases on these projects. So having that clear accountability, easier said than done, but it's something that really needs to be focused on. So that's a bit about the big failure at the Pentagon, but I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts below as well. Now, I want to shift gears here and get into the second case study here in the government space before we get into our really deep dive here in our next segment. But in this next one that I want to talk about is Babson College and how they have gone all in on AI with higher education in their case. So just to give you some backdrop here of what's in this article, Babson College is embedding AI across every part of the institution, and they're not just experimenting, they're doing a full transformation with AI. They've got AI-powered teaching tools, AI-infused curriculum for students. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but they call it AI-infused curriculum and institutional process improvements. And the goal is to prepare students for an AI-first economy, which I think is a great idea because I think we're going to have to live with AI, like it or not. We're going to have to live with AI for a long time, and it's going to be a great opportunity for those that embrace it. And the students want students to be able to use AI in real world business scenarios, understand the ethics and societal impact of AI, and learn how to lead in an AI enabled environment. So I think sounds like a pretty cutting edge curriculum that they've developed at Babson. And AI isn't replacing teachers in their case or in the way they're embracing AI. It's meant to enhance the experience. They're using AI tools to personalize learning, free up faculty time for more interaction with students, and let students co-create content simulations and business models. not just with each other, but also using AI tools. They're also focusing on responsible and ethical AI use, and a big part of their effort is educating students and staff on data privacy, bias mitigation, and transparency and explainability in AI systems. And at the end of the day, the college sees AI as a differentiator for recruiting and branding, and AI is now a core selling point for the institution. And so Babson is actively promoting its AI approach in marketing campaigns, alumni engagement, and also donor and partner conversations. So I imagine people are getting pretty excited, I would imagine, for this, especially if you're a student looking at colleges, to see a school like this or a university like this that is spending and investing so much time and money on AI and preparing them for the future. I think could be a very powerful thing. So I'm curious to hear from the audience, though, a couple questions for the audience. One is, what other colleges or universities are going all in on AI now? Are you familiar with any colleges or universities that are doing this? And if not at the higher ed level, have you seen use cases at the K through 12 or the lower level education level? We work with a number of primary and secondary education entities in our consulting practice at Third Stage. We have yet to see significant use of AI with those clients, and we have yet to see significant interest in AI in those entities. But I'd love to hear your feedback if you're seeing that anywhere right now. And I'm curious to hear too from the audience. Do you think this is the future of higher education? This full digital transformation, not just making these, occasional incremental tweaks to the curriculum, but completely overhauling their curriculum to infuse AI into it. I'm curious to hear what you think. Do you think this is the trend of higher ed? And then also another question for you all is, how can higher ed leaders ensure AI is used ethically in both teaching and administration? So love to hear your feedback and comments. And again, this is meant to be a very engaging episode because we're drawing such a focused group of people that are in the government space. I'd love to share some thoughts here and use this as a knowledge sharing or peer knowledge sharing here in today's episode. So be sure to drop in the chat below what your thoughts are on that. I'd also be curious to hear from the audience what you think about combining AI with human creativity. What do you think of that? Do you think that'll become the standard? Because I find it super interesting. I think it's super cool. I think AI does open up a lot of creative outlets for people. I mean, I know myself personally, it's sort of taken little, sparks of creativity in my head and blown them up into, bigger and better things. And so I can imagine, for a kid going to college, that especially a creative type or someone who is open to creative stuff like that, that could be a pretty big deal. And I'd also be curious on how, what some of the challenges are of embedding AI into so many processes throughout an organization all at once. So I'd be curious to hear from those of you that are experimenting with, or maybe you're going all in on AI within your government organization. Be curious to hear from you what your experience has been and sort of how you're approaching that whole thing. So a lot of good stuff there, and a lot of really interesting points that we can learn from at Babson College. So great stuff. A couple good use cases or case studies of one being a failure or an ongoing failure and debacle at the Pentagon in the United States. We talked about Babson College, and next, after a break, we're going to get into a panel discussion where we talk about another government entity case study. This one is a $1 billion failure at SAAQ, which is the auto insurance board within Canada, Quebec, Canada's government. We're going to bring on a panel discussion to talk about that. And then after that, we're going to have a government CIO on the show to just pick his brain and talk about what has made his modernization effort successful, what have been some of the takeaways, lessons learned, the good, the bad, the ugly of some of his experience having been through so many government tech modernization efforts over the last 25 years. So stick around. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be back with more of this special government digital transformation episode of Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
I want to invite you to join me and other thought leaders in the digital transformation space to Stratosphere 2025. It's an annual conference we've hosted now for 7 years in a row. It's a great event. It's live in Denver, Colorado, but we're also offering it virtually via hybrid tickets. And we're going to have a lot of different speakers here, including myself as a keynote, as well as others that you may know from the industry. And this is a perfect conference if you're interested in any sort of digital transformation, including ERP and CRM and HCM. And actually, the theme for this year's session is AI and how AI is affecting all different types of digital transformation. But in addition to AI, we'll also talk about the fundamentals of digital transformation, including program management, evaluating the right software, digital strategy, change management, process improvement, all the things you need to know to make your project successful. It's also a great way to network and learn from others. So just being part of a community that is also like-minded and going through the same things you are, that's another value. And you can join, like I said, remotely, in person, and you can also buy VIP tickets if you'd like more exclusive access to me and others from the third stage team and other speakers that are going to be there. So I hope to see you soon. Check out my discount code below for discounted tickets. You can go to stratosphere2025.com for more information, including the full agenda, and I hope to see you there.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 228. This is the special episode, the government digital transformation episode of Transformation Ground Control. We're covering all things related to government and the public sector and nonprofit sector here. And we're even getting into higher ed and other pseudo-government entities as well. And the whole idea here is to share with you some use cases and best practices to help you learn how to make your government modernization efforts more successful going forward. And before we get into our panel discussion here, I also want to encourage you, if you are in the government space and about to go through a government sort of transformation or modernization efforts, I encourage you to download our new guide. We just published it called The Guide to Government Digital Transformation. So in that, we cover a bunch of trends, independent reviews and rankings of different government ERP systems and government IT systems, lessons from other government entities. We cover all that stuff in our new Government Digital Transformation Report. I encourage you to download that. You can use the QR code right here or go to the links below. So with that all being said, I want to jump into our panel discussion here where we're chatting with a panel about this new news that just broke with SAAQ, which is the Auto Insurance Board for the Quebec, Canada government. And they recently started a project that was meant to be $500 million in total, ended up being over $1.1 billion with very little to show for it. So we're going to dive into some of the developments that are happening here, including a police raid and some other really interesting things. There's a full-on anti-corruption investigation into the project. The anti-corruption group, I forgot the exact name of the group, but it's a government, an arm of the government that is the anti-corruption arm of the government, is actually physically went in, raided the offices, took a bunch of documents, and they're investigating potential corruption on the project. So there's a lot developing here. A lot of stuff is going to change and emerge over time. But regardless of how that all turns out, there's so many lessons and so many mistakes that were made in this project just based on public record and public information that's been published that we really want to dive into it. Joining us on this panel, I'll introduce each here in a moment, but we've got a lawyer, we've got a consultant, we've got an industry analyst, and we have a government CIO. So we're trying to get the perspective here of 4 different perspectives and trying to unpack what's going on here in this case. But just to real quickly set the stage, I'll give you the real high level summary of what's happening at SAAQ in Canada. It's a government entity. It's basically a government agency that handles auto insurance and other related services for citizens in Quebec area. They recently went to implement SAP with IBM. Their original budget was somewhere between $500 and $600 million Canadian dollars. Ended up being over $1 billion, and they still have nothing to show for it. And that was already interesting enough right there, in my opinion. That right there is a case study to talk about. But then it gets more interesting. Last week, at the time we're recording this, the anti-corruption group within the Quebec government actually raided their offices, and they're collecting documentation and trying to find evidence of possible corruption. So there's a whole nother layer there. That's almost sounds like we're doing a gossip pop culture sort of discussion here, but it's actually related to enterprise technology, strangely enough. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about this big failure, what some of the lessons and takeaways are, and what we can do and what you can do as organizations to ensure that you're avoiding some of these same problems. So joining us here is several different guests. And I'm actually, one thing I did just realize is I have the wrong, I can't change it now. I was going to change the formatting of the screen, but I can't do it now since we're live. But I'm going to introduce our guests here, starting with you, Scott. And actually, just to set the stage for Scott, I actually read this article on Friday. One of our team members forwarded me an article from CIO magazine about this recent development in the case as far as the police raids and the potential anti-corruption. And I was reading the article, and I saw Scott's name mentioned in the article, and he had a couple quotes in there. And I know Scott, and I know his company, Infotech. So, Scott, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Scott Bickley, an advisory fellow at Infotech Research Group. We basically in our practice cover vendor management, contract review, mega vendors from a commercial licensing implementation perspective.
Great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. And then Ron Puccinelli, the government CIO perspective is why you're here. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Ron.
Thank you, Eric. My name is Ron Puccinelli. I'm government CIO with 25 plus years experience. I've also got 20 some years experience in the private sector at the same levels and below. Seems like I've been doing ERP implementations pretty much my entire career. So this one hit really close to home. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And Ron is actually a 2-time client of ours at Third Stage. And you would think after being a 2-time client, I would say Ron Puccinelli instead of Ron Pucciolini. But I still have a mental block about your name being Ron Pucciolini, so I apologize for that.
Call me anything but late for dinner.
Good. All right, so Fred Hessler from the Third Stage team. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Eric. Fred Hessler. I'm a director in Third Stage's expert witness practice, where I focus on litigation support and project interventions and retrospectives. I've got about a 40-year career in enterprise software, 32 years in various consulting roles.
Great. Thanks for being here. And then and you also do project recoveries too, in addition to expert witness. So you have that perspective of how to clean up some of these projects. So that'll be a great lens that we can analyze this case through. And then last but not least, Marcus Harris, the attorney side of things. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Marcus.
Yeah, well, my name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney. I've been drafting and negotiating software-related agreements, implementation-related contracts, and litigating failed ERP projects in courts across the country for over 20 years. And I like to say that I've seen everything but I certainly haven't seen something exactly like this. And I think this one takes the cake, and it's a little bit shocking and unusual. So I'm excited to talk about this today.
Yeah, it is very shocking and unusual, and I haven't seen anything like it either. Just when you think you've seen the craziest of the crazy, you end up seeing a case like this.
Yeah.
So, and I gave you a quick backdrop. And by the way, I usually do this at the very beginning, but I'd love to hear from the audience where you're joining from today. So if you don't mind dropping in the chat what city or country you're joining from, it's always great to hear what community you're joining from. And also, if you're in Quebec, I would love to hear that in particular too, because I'd love to hear how this has impacted you potentially, or sort of boots on the ground. How has this affected the average citizen in the Quebec area? Because it's more than just sounds like it's more than just an ERP failure. It's more than just corruption. It's also, how does this affect people at the end of the day? So drop in the chat if you don't mind what city and country you're joining from. And by the way, I was going to play a fun little game too, maybe just to get things started before I get into the meat of this. For some of the promos we put out for this event, I was using the line, "Send lawyers, guns, and money," because it sort of stuck in my head. But there's a quote from a song that I love that says, "Send lawyers, guns, and money. The shit has hit the fan." And that, I don't know why that just popped in my head as soon as I read this article, but I'd love to hear if anyone knows who the artist is that created that quote or that lyric. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat below.
That's Warren Zevon. Oh, sorry. Oh,
give it away, Fred.
The audience to do it. Sorry about that.
All right. Well, tell us in the chat if you've heard the song "Lawyers, Guns, and Money" from Warren Zevon. It's a great song, and it just literally, as soon as I read this article, that's the song that popped in my head: is "Send lawyers, guns, and money." All right, so we've got a lot of people chiming in here and where they're joining from, and I'll get to that here in just a second, and as well as anyone else who might have heard that Warren Zevon song. But I want to start with you, Scott, here for just a second. This whole panel, by the way, has read the articles about this, the public articles, and we've actually read an auditor's report. So the Quebec government did an audit of the project a few months ago just to see what went wrong and figure out how this got so out of hand and how taxpayer money was mismanaged this badly. And the whole premise of it was not only to fix that project, but to figure out for other modernization efforts throughout Quebec, how could they avoid the same fate? So we got the full report from the auditors that did it. It was in French. We had to translate it because none of us speak French, and we've read the whole thing. So when you read all the details that we have about this case so far, Scott, and you were quoted in the article, the CIO article that mentioned this case more recently, what was your initial reaction? Was there anything that surprised you about this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the scope and scale of this particular project failure was what struck me most dramatically. I mean, we're not unaccustomed to seeing large, complex, ERP related projects, especially in the public sector where the scrutiny is quite high. Those failures, get the limelight on them. I don't think we hear about the successes, nearly as much. So something goes live and it works, you tend to just go on with life. But that being said, I mean, I think there is a trend here with, when you're talking about projects of this scale, 9 figures plus, and high complexity. And, first thing that struck me was just the complete lack of preparation and due diligence in terms of investment and time and money to prepare for this. This is a bespoke, highly customized project. Seemingly, looking at the vendors involved, I was kind of scratching my head saying, are those platforms right for this type of functionality? There was a lot of things that immediately struck me as being off. So I think once it progressed past those initial stages, there were still multiple points in the process where this train could have been stopped before it completely went off the tracks, and it just went every chance there was to stop the train and to keep this thing from falling apart. It just was moved forward and moved forward and moved forward, and I think that's where we will eventually get into kind of project dysfunction morphed into ethical issues and kind of the corruption aspect, if you will.
Yeah. Good point. And so, Ron, coming to you from the perspective of a CIO who's been through these transformations before, I mean, could you imagine anything like this happening on your watch, or if it were developing on your watch, what's your reaction to this whole thing?
Knock on wood, I've not had to do this personally. I have had to come in and clean a few of these up, not at this scale, That's always a lot of work as well. But I think the thing that jumped out at me to follow on with what Scott was saying is we've been hearing these same threads were specifically related to ERP type solutions and digital transitions in general of why are you trying to what I call boil the ocean? Let's break it into smaller pieces. It's easier, it's less risk. We got to do the upfront preparation. You got to invest in looking at your processes before you try and automate your processes. Otherwise, you're just automating garbage, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
All of which seems to have contributed to the challenges that Quebec faced. I think the biggest thing that caught my attention was, if I remember the numbers correctly, something like a 560 plus day delay on a key oversight management report to the sponsors, to the stakeholders. You can't manage a project 2.5 years in arrears. It just, things get out of hand too fast.
Yeah, they do. And one thing that you guys both have alluded to is this fact that they had decided they wanted a highly customized, unique system. And part of it too, there's sort of two pieces of this project. They had sort of the back office ERP-ish sort of system or focus, and then they had the front customer or the citizen facing side of things where people could register their insurance and their sort of their license plates and all that stuff on a website. So it's sort of an e-commerce thing. So there's those two pieces of it. So they say they wanted a highly customized system, but then they chose SAP without any real due diligence. They just chose SAP. It sounds like they didn't do a full evaluation. They didn't define their requirements in any sort of detail. What's your take on that, Fred, as an expert witness and just as an ERP consultant in general? Clearly, that's not best practice, but what's your reaction to it beyond that?
Well, first of all, just obviously the presence of anti-corruption investigators makes this one extra spicy, right? We don't see that every day. So that made it interesting to begin with. But in terms of their preparation for it, yeah, according to the auditor's report, they did some very sort of surface analysis, and they were comparing two generic solutions, a custom build or an ERP in general. And unfortunately, they had an SAP consultant, it appears, doing the evaluation. So unsurprisingly, the chosen solution was an ERP. And then even less surprisingly, the chosen solution was SAP after that. What's interesting about this is it might have been one of those fairly rare situations these days where a lot of custom development might have been the right answer, actually. A monolithic ERP implementation probably was not, because they all knew there would be a great deal of customization going in.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's right there. You're starting the project with totally misaligned strategies. I mean, you're saying one thing on one hand, you want a highly customized system, and then you go out and pick SAP, which is not meant to be customized. People customize it too much as it is, but it's not meant to be a highly custom developed system. If they wanted a custom system, that's okay. It's nothing wrong with that, but don't go with an ERP system, which totally conflicts with that. How about you, Marcus? What was your initial take when you noticed or when you jumped into this case?
Yeah, I think it's really just the presence of, collusion, deception. I think there was an allegation of contempt of Parliament. There was a cover-up. There was an allegation that project status reports that were submitted to Parliament were modified to minimize, the red flags. And to me, I mean, that in and of itself is just shocking. Is that the level of the cover-up on the part of SAAQ is certainly unusual. And the allegations that there was some sort of collusion in the selection of the integrator and the software vendor is very interesting and not something that you see often. So, I mean, from a legality standpoint, I think all of that is very interesting. I think if you take a step back, it's shocking to me that just, you see this, that's certainly unusual, but the unpreparedness, the unsophistication of the auto insurance, SAAQ company here in taking this project on is not something that at that scale that you see. And I think it's interesting that, in some of the documentation that I looked at in preparation for talking to you guys today, there were allegations that, their team was immature, arguably incompetent, unsophisticated. But that points the finger right back at the vendors as well. I mean, they're taking advantage of that situation, and they're the ones that you've got to look at too. I think here there's blame to go around, and I think it's going to be easy to point the blame at SAAQ, but you've also got to look at the vendors here that were just kind of taking the money and arguably taking advantage of the situation they found themselves in. I mean, you don't get to a $1 billion failure very easily, and
it doesn't happen overnight. It
No,
didn't just,
does
they
not.
woke up one day and say, "Oh my gosh, we're at $1 billion. What happened?" This was a slow death by paper cut sort of thing that began way in the beginning. It began when, they had, after that initial discovery phase, when they started to get into the requirements and everything. Right then, they were already recasting the budget and everything. But to your point about hiding stuff, that's the part that's really interesting. Is it sounds like up the chain within SAAQ, it was sort of a CYA, like how do we cover our ass? How do we make things look better than they really are? And then when things started to go south, it sounds like they broke this into smaller projects, almost like to hide smoke and mirrors, like sleight of hand, to hide the fact that they were going over the overall budget. But they had these little mini projects. It was hard for the public or for the people responsible for overall at the higher levels to see what was actually happening. And so that's a sort of shame on both parties, really. I mean, you had the vendors to blame for sure between SAP and IBM. And to be clear, it was a division of IBM. I can't remember the name of it. Was it LGS?
Yes, that's right.
LGS. So it was a part of IBM that was doing the SAP implementation, but lots of blame to go around all around there. So Ron, I want to come to you for a second here. From a CIO perspective, when you've gone through these projects and you've got vendors that they're doing their own COIA at times too, right? Like I imagine in this case, SAP and LGS/IBM weren't 100% transparent, partially because they need to look good. They need to keep the client. They want to keep that revenue stream going. So to some degree, there's an economic incentive for them to hide some of the problems that inevitably happen in a project like this. But from your perspective, sitting at the client side of things, what are some of the early warning signs, or what have you done to sort of draw this out, to draw out the early warning signs in a project like this?
Sure. Great question. So I think three of the things that I try to do in larger scale projects is we put together a cross-functional steering team. I use sort of a steering team, core team, extended team construct. But that steering team is made up of the key stakeholders, the business process owners for whatever it is we're talking about. In case of ERP, it's typically finance and human resources. I do that for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, I'm not the business process expert on any of that. I need their wisdom, their expertise, their knowledge about, is this going to work or is this not going to work? The other piece I do, and I've done this a couple of times with you and your team, Eric, is I want to have an independent third party help me assess, are we running into red flags early? Are we starting to see yellow flags? How do we make course corrections before they become showstoppers? I do that for a couple of reasons. I'm in the thick of it, so it's kind of like I can't see the forest because the tree's right in front of my face. So I need that third party outside perspective to say, hey, vendors saying this, we're seeing that, there's a disconnect here. We need to make sure everything's still good. And finally is, again, breaking up projects from the beginning, not 2/3 of the way through or however far into it you are, of saying, in this particular instance, this was going to be a 10-year program. That's not a 10-year project. In my way of thinking, that should be 10 one-year projects or something similar to that. That way, again, we're not trying to boil the ocean. We're focusing on deliverable 1, then we're focusing on deliverable 2, then we're focusing on deliverable 3. And again, managing risk, reducing risk, increasing transparency by having a third party, having the right senior stakeholders involved can help, but it's not a guarantee. The other thing to remember is the vendor is not in this because they want to help you. They're in this to make money. The billable hours is their incentive. And if you don't manage that, you end up in these large overruns extremely quickly. That's why you want to do the work up front, the 3 to 6 months of phase 0, I think the article called it. You got to define your requirements. You got to do the process work. You got to have the teams in place. You got to invest in that organizational change management construct so that you, the client, are the ones driving the consultant, not the other way around.
Yeah, it's a great point, and you bring up a bunch of good points as far as the economic incentive and how in this case SAP and IBM, their goal is to make money. And here's the interesting thing about digital transformations in general is that these are highly risky projects and highly costly projects for any organization.
Mm-hmm.
And the only parties that are guaranteed to come out okay on the other side are the vendors. They're always going to make money no matter what. And guess what? Their only risk is getting sued. And that is a risk, but it's not nearly as risky or common as a failure that can affect your operations for years down the road, on top of having budget overruns and time overruns and all the other chaos that goes along with that. So that's super interesting point. And I want to come back to a point that you actually mentioned in the CIO article here in just a second, Scott. But you make a point, a really important point in that article. I'm going to come back to it. But first, I want to just say hello to the audience here. We had a lot of people chiming in on where they're joining from. Michael on YouTube joining from Cleveland, Ohio. Thanks for being here. Ed joining from Texas, Dallas-Fort Worth. Thanks for being here, Ed. Someone from Montreal, Quebec, Canada on LinkedIn, although I can't see their name. They probably wanted to be anonymous because they maybe have something juicy to tell us about the what's going on the ground. And for whoever that is that's joining from Quebec, I'd love to hear your perspective. If are you noticing a service disruption as a citizen of Quebec, or what's the word on the street? I'd love to hear your perspective there in the chat. Oops, having an issue here. Hold on. Someone joined on LinkedIn from Rotterdam, Stanislav, I believe it is. Matthias joining from Copenhagen, Phil joining from Columbus, Ohio. We've got someone joining from India, Spain, Denver. We've got people all over the world. So thanks for being here today. Really appreciate you all joining. A couple other people from Canada. Karen's in Ottawa, Canada. So thank you for being here today. So I'd love to hear in the chat too, by the way, as we're going through these questions, what do you think so far? What do you think the big challenges here were? What's your initial reaction to this? Because we're coming at it from our, expert opinions or whatever you want to call it, but I'd love to hear your perspectives. And I'm sure many of you are experts as well. So I'd love to hear your perspectives in the chat on what your takeaways are here so far. So in the article, Scott, in the CIO article that was published last week, and this is actually the article that sparked this event, this live event that we're doing right now. You were quoted in there and you made a comment that's super interesting that I feel like is really under discussed. And it's not something that's very commonly discussed amongst us experts in the industry. And that is this concept of decision latency. And you talked about how decision latency can create problems in this case, but in general can create problems on digital transformations. I totally agree with the point, but I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah. What's really interesting is one of your previous podcasts some time ago where you had Hans and Mulder on from, and was talking about the research that they had done at the Standish Group. I linked in with Hans and he sent me over one of their reports and it was amazing how critical, like even more important than the quality of the decisions you make, the speed at which you make decisions is the real driver as to whether your project has a chance for success. I think the logic behind that is, if you fail fast, right, you can recoup and you can change those decisions and you could do it fast before you get too far down a rabbit hole, the way I would phrase it. And it really also ties back to a lot of what Ron was talking about in terms of the setup on these projects, right? So if you don't have the right internal team structure and the right governance structure set up, then you really don't have a chance to make good or fast decisions in any organized manner, right? And to the point about the vendor, I mean, if you go to a mega vendor in this space, especially in the ERP space, we kind of characterize the vendor as one entity, and it's not. You're dealing with a sales team, and that sales team is incented on selling you a solution. So they're going to of course speak to the high level requirements and the if you haven't done the due diligence to really get down into a granular level to put them on the spot to say, is your solution really going to be able to handle these types of unique requirements for a municipality? And, have you done this before? And, any type of vetting, they're going to sell you the solution and say, you know, yeah, our solution's highly configurable. We could do anything for you. And so you put all of those things together, and then the last point Ron made was the not having that technology agnostic third party in there. That is what levels the playing field, right? That's what allows you to, you know, how often do you do these projects at this scale as an organization? You know, once in your career, maybe twice if you have a full career in this space. So you know, everything is tilted against the customer in this case. And so you pull all those three things together and you just don't have a chance to make decisions quickly, and you don't have a chance to course correct. You know, I've experienced this in my past life. I've had, you know, great teams where we were well organized and able to be fairly adaptable and flexible and agile. And then, you know, other instances where, you know, projects just get paralyzed and decisions go to die in some executive committee. And the next thing you know, what happens is when you don't make those decisions fast and with confidence and decisiveness, you start to sow doubt into the rest of the organization, and then decisions just start to stack up on one another, and you really get yourself into a quagmire.
Yeah. And I think on top of that, it's helpful to maybe show in a slow motion example of how that plays out, what you just described. So let's just say I'm a consultant. I come in, I work for IBM. I'm an SAP consultant. I come in and I say, okay, this is my team right here. I'm having a workshop to make some decisions around how we're gonna configure the software. And in my project plan, I assume we're gonna have this workshop today, and then tomorrow I'm gonna start configuring. But what happens typically is you come to this workshop, we have a discussion, and we can't decide because either we aren't all on the same page, or you need to go talk to your team. You're uncertain of, you know, whatever it is. You're uncertain of what the decision should be, and we don't make a decision today. Maybe it takes us a week to get the right stakeholders together to make the decision. So now, instead of me starting the configuration tomorrow, I have to wait a week. But as a consultant, I'm not going to say, okay, pencils down, stop the meter, turn the meter off. I'm going to stop billing. They're going to keep billing. So they're billing while they're sitting around billing while you're trying to make a decision. And that's just one small example, but you add that up hundreds, thousands of times throughout a project. Now all of a sudden you're talking about, you know, a 2-year project becoming a 3 or 4 year project, and a, you know, $100 million project turning into a $300 million project. That's how it happens largely.
So an interesting statistic out of that chaos study was they estimate that there's one decision to be made per $1,000 in expenditure per in labor, right, and third party labor. So, you know, you take, you know, 1,000, you know, times, you know, 100 million times 500 million, or however much proportion of that spend is in labor. I mean, you start to stack up thousands of decisions, and these could be really small decisions. They could be really big decisions. But to your point, if you don't have a mechanism by which people have authority and are empowered to make decisions, and without having to have everything go all the way up the stack to the executive level, then you get completely paralyzed very quickly.
That's a super interesting stat, and I was not aware of that. So one decision for every $1,000 spent on a project.
Yep.
Yeah. And thousands of decisions, and some of those are easy decisions. I imagine some of them are really meaty decisions, like how are we going to run our business? Or, here's a conflict between way software works, way business works. What are we going to do? And
well, I think something in this report said there was like 47 legacy systems that they were trying to deprecate and pull together. I mean, forget about everything else. Just that alone would yield 10,000 decisions. I mean, that's an insane scope to try to take on at one time.
Yeah. And you're also touching on, and I want to ask you this about this, Fred, you know, this concept of phase zero. We talk about it a lot here at Third Stage, and it's becoming more and more commonly discussed in the industry, but this concept of phase zero is what we're talking about. Really, that's what we're getting at, as sort of a solution here, which is you're going to have to make the decisions. It's not that these decisions get any easier or that they go away. It's about when you make the decisions. Do you wait until the meter's running and the cash is just accumulating, that the spend is just burning up cash? So tell us a little bit about phase zero and how that might have affected this if they would have done a proper phase zero.
Well, first of all, they might have gone a different direction with regard to solution. And I don't just mean the software provider, I just mean the philosophy. They might have gone with different point solutions and a lot of custom development, integration, and so forth. Just feels like from a little bit we've read about this, that might have been a better approach here, although I can't say for sure. But once you had determined the approach you want to take, One thing that struck me is something we see all the time. They didn't do any requirements work. They relied on the client for deliverable 2, which involved driver's licenses and registrations, among other things. They relied on the client to document as-is processes. And it took them a long time, right? Well over a year after the contract was executed. And one of the common things we see in expert witness cases is that the provider assumes they can do requirements discovery in elaboration. They assume 98% of the requirements discovery is going to be done in a little bit of elaboration instead of doing upfront work. And this is a common problem. I see, and for going on for several years, I see practitioners simply not doing any sort of requirements analysis work up front and just assuming, sort of hand-waving away the complexity. And in this particular case, the auditor said the requirements around driver's licenses and registrations were grossly minimized, and that's primarily what led to the budget overruns. And we do see this phenomenon happen a lot. It's easy for the practitioners to kind of hand wave away the complexity and assume they'll figure it out as they go. And that rarely works. It's an excuse not to do any work, honestly. And I see it too often.
Yeah. Yeah, great point. I'm going to come back and get Marcus and Ron. I've got a follow-up question for you here in just a second, but want to turn to the audience here real quickly. Again, we've got Fernando joining from Lima, Peru, beautiful part of the world. Thanks for joining. HW joining from South Africa, Ness joining from Los Angeles. HW on YouTube says, seems there is a universal defect. Could be. Although I think, to be honest, I think the potential defects in the system were probably the least of the problems here because I think some of those defects may have been self-inflicted, and there's all this other stuff that seemed to play into it. And again, I apologize, I don't know this person's name, but the person joining from Quebec came back with a response of, well, how does it look? What's it like now? So this is the perspective of someone living in Quebec and how it's affected them. So they say, initially, yes, there was a big disruption in services with impact of a couple of months. Nowadays, the platform is working really well, and you can access information about your own license plates, vehicles registered under your name, and you can do changes. The other day, I had to request a license plate change and was able to do it within just a few clicks, paid the money, and got the template in less than a week. So it sounds like the system's working okay now. I guess the question is, was it worth $1.1 billion, and was it worth all the heartache that led up to where you are today? I mean, that's always the $1 million question. If you can get to the other side, great, but what's the collateral damage along the way? Some other comments here. HW on YouTube says, seems there was a deficit in outcome-based and stage gate governance models. This is a really good point because, Marcus, I guess from your perspective as an attorney, when you think about when to move on and to say everything's okay, so let's move on to the next stage of the project, let's move on to the next phase, how does that factor into some of these cases from a legal perspective?
Well, those are always critical, right? I mean, what you don't do, and what happened here is they rushed to. It looks like they rushed to a go line. I mean, I think some of the documentation suggested that they had only completed 20% of the testing that they should have, and they ignored red flags and went live anyway. I mean, you certainly can't do that and expect success. So I think, from a contractual governance standpoint, you want to have a framework put in place that dictates milestones, deliverable deadlines, testing requirements, what happens when deliverable testing doesn't work, what is the vendor or the integrator obligated to do. You want to have all of these things detailed with a very high level of specificity. But if you don't spend this time in this phase 0 that we were talking about a little bit ago, you don't have the tools to be able to do that properly. I mean, you've got to put the work in on the front end to make sure that you have the data, the information, the requirements to be able to govern that project throughout the life cycle of that project. And if you don't do that, I think you're really just going to set yourself up for failure. And, who's to blame for that? Well, I think the blame, there's enough to go around, as I said before, but certainly, I mean, a customer that is not doing the initial due diligence, that is, hiring their friends, which may have happened in this case, and then covering up, the collusion, that is a recipe for absolute disaster. And I think that's what you got here. We understand from the person in Quebec that it's working, fairly well today. But like you said, I mean, what's the consequence of that? And I think government investigations, criminal liability, it's all waiting for these people. So
yeah, that's great point. I want to come back to actually a couple of conflicting comments here that maybe, Ron, you could help us sort out a little bit here from a CIO perspective. So, and they're not necessarily in conflict. They're just two different opinions that need to be reconciled at times. So Kenneth on LinkedIn says decision frameworks are needed, empower teams to make decisions. And it sounds fair enough. But when I put it up against this question, this is where I wanted to get your take, Ron. This is from someone totally different. This is from Michael on YouTube. Says the challenges are that we are in the environment of no transparency. As businesses, we look to integrators as experts, and the integrator's motivation is to make revenue. My organization is failing. So on one hand, yes, you need to empower teams, you need decision frameworks. But on the other hand, when I say we, if I'm you, Ron, we're not the experts. We're not. We run a government agency and government entity. We don't do this for a living. You do, Mr. or Mrs. Consultant. So how do you reconcile that? How do you empower the team, but at the same time have ownership of the team when you're not an expert on this stuff? How did you find that right balance in your experience so far?
It's not easy. I'll give you that much. It's a challenge. I think there are two, maybe three key ways we approach this. I approach this. One is at contract and sales level. If I know that I'm taking on a project that my organization may not have expertise in, then I want to do one of two things. I want to find another consultant, a third-party consultant that has that expertise that can help me ride herd on what's going on, or alternatively, put that onus on the contractor who's doing the implementation. Say, look, you are the expert. In contract, I'm explicitly saying it's your job to make the right decisions, to let me know what has to change to make that transparency. Without that, it will not be in their boilerplate contract. It's just going to be, we're going to bill you monthly and you're going to pay within 15 days and yay, let's go. The other side of that is, it's really easy to say, well, I can't see what they're doing. I don't know what they're doing. But then that comes back a little bit on me as a CIO for my organization of saying, well, if I don't understand what's happening, how do I ever be successful at managing this? I need to make sure I understand. I need to make sure that the consultant, the implementer explains it to me in a way that I can get it, that my fellow leaders in the project can get it, and we can explain it to our key stakeholders, our board, our electeds, whatever it might be. So it comes down to, if you're not really clear on what you're trying to get to, sort of like if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. That works, but again, you run into lots of cost exposure and litigation exposure and things like that. So make sure your contracts back up any weak areas you feel you might have. If visibility is one of them, build that in. Bring in a third party, build it into your contract, whatever that might be, so that you have the visibility, you have the levers you can pull on the project to say things are good, things are not good. And one thing I think our attorney was mentioning is, don't ignore those yellow flags and red flags. When somebody says there might be a problem here, assume there is, dig in and figure it out. Do that as fast as you possibly can and as thoroughly as you possibly can. Most of the time it will end up being nothing super bad. Occasionally it will be, but you want to catch those surprises when they're as small as possible so that you don't end up, on the cover of magazines like this one.
Right. It's great. It's great advice. And for Michael and others that might be questioning where they are in their project, I'm going to include a QR code right here, top left side of your screen. I'll include a link below in the description of this podcast. But if you want a assessment from experts like Fred and myself, others from Third Stage, feel free to scan that QR code. We actually do free assessments for organizations that are looking for a second opinion or just sort of a gut check informally. There's no cost to it, just to get a feel for what some of those red flags might be. Because I think if you go through these projects and you're seeing all green on the status reports, even if it's day one of the project, I'd say something's wrong. You've got to have yellow or maybe even red. It's not bad, by the way. If you've got red on the status report, okay, that sucks, but at least you know it and you can address it. You have time to tackle it. If you push it off and your vendor's saying, hey, it's all green, everything's fine, and they're sweeping stuff under the rug, you've got to ask tough questions. Like if you've got to, not because you want to be overly skeptical either, by the way, but you do need to be a bit skeptical and say, I don't believe that everything could possibly be green, because guess what? These are really hard projects. They're very difficult. They're very risky. No matter who you are, no matter how good you are as an organization at leading change, it's going to be challenging. So that's super interesting. And so you having a agnostic, and I know this is going to be a plug for Third Stage and Infotech as well. Third Stage and Infotech, Marcus is obviously tech agnostic, but having tech agnostic providers that can take a look with a fresh set of eyes that aren't getting paid by the software vendors, that's really important. Because if you're the only one, if you as a client are the only one that your consultant is making money off of, then they're going to represent your interest, not necessarily that of the vendor. So I think that's an important thing. So I'll leave that QR code up here if you'd like an assessment. And we actually have a number of free assessments we do for organizations throughout the world. So feel free to scan that if you'd like to learn more about it or register for that. So Marcus, I want to come to you on this point, the same point around, because I know you talk a lot about this in cases that you're involved with and you and I have worked on together. This whole concept of, hey, we're not the expert, but the expert is here and they're telling us what we need to do, and we believed the vendor, and therefore it's all their fault when this project fails. What's your reaction to that, or how do you assign blame in this case?
Well, I mean, I think it's critical in these contracts that you really have to identify that vendor or that integrator as an expert. You hired them for a reason, and they're the ones that do this every day. They make their living doing this, and the life cycle of these projects is so long that the likelihood that anybody in your organization has done more than one or two of these is probably small, right? Unless you're hiring experienced people for these skill sets. They're managed kind of on a part-time basis by subject matter experts. And I mean, you really need to put contractual language in not only the consulting agreement, the MSA, but those statements of work. And there's always assumptions provisions in these statements of work. And the form contracts that you're going to get from your integrator are going to put all of the responsibility for the success of that project onto you as a customer. And you have to push back on that. Certainly there's dependencies, right? You've got to make these decisions quickly. You've got to provide the right access, the right information to them, but it's not that one-sided. And I think there's got to be some sort of a balance here, because if you have a bad contract and you get into a situation like this, you have no dog in the fight. You have no recourse. They will know it, and they'll walk all over you. And I think the likelihood that these things are going to fail is really high, and the likelihood that you're going to end up in litigation, while not as high, it is still there. And if you end up in litigation with a contract that doesn't protect your interests, you really aren't going to get very far. And that's not a good position to be in. Out millions and millions of dollars on a failed project and then without any recourse is not where I want to see my clients.
Yeah. How about you, Fred, as an expert witness, which, by the way, just for those that don't know what an expert witness does, an expert witness would be someone like Fred, who's below me on the screen, working with Marcus next to him, who's an attorney. Attorneys are there to assess legal liability and to make their argument for their client, whether it's plaintiff or defense. Expert witness, Fred, on the other hand, is someone who's the expert that comes in and analyzes the facts of the case. What happened? What went wrong? What's your opinion on why the project failed? And then Marcus would go to take that to court and say, look, our expert witness said this, and that. Therefore, here's whose fault it is. But tell us a little bit from, as an expert witness perspective, what's your take on assessing blame? Is it in this case, how much of it, how would you determine whether this is all SAAQ's fault, whether it's all SAP's fault, whether it's all IBM's fault, or some combination of all the above?
It's fairly clear it's everybody's fault in this
Right,
case.
it is.
It's more a question of ratios than anything else at this point. How you would assess blame is we can see symptoms from the auditor's report, right, that are pretty glaring. And we've all been involved in projects like this. And so we can intuit probably what happened or likely what happened to cause them. But if you're really going to investigate this, the best evidence is contemporaneous evidence from when decisions were made, right? It's email conversations and meeting recordings and things like that, where you can actually see the problems developing, the rationalizations developing, the explanations developing, and so on. Once you get to even status reports contain narrative setting and so forth, and they basically just point you back and make you suspicious before you to look for other evidence. By the time you get deep into a case and there's depositions and so forth, depositions are a lot of fun to read, in my opinion, but there's a lot of narrative setting and selective memory, and memories have faded. And again, what they really do is just point you back and tell you, I think I'll look for evidence to back up this or that. Going through emails is really the best way to assess the problem.
I'm here with a panel discussing the massive $1 billion ERP failure at a government agency in Canada. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more of episode 228 of Transformation Ground Control.
Just tell me what you've got to say to me. I've been waiting for so long.
My name is Eric Kimberling, and I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to invite you to learn a little bit more about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. I've included a link to a video right here that describes Third Stage in a bit more detail. It talks about our story, our history, our philosophy, our clients, our service offerings, and that sort of thing. But in general, what Third Stage Consulting does is we're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting provider. We help clients through their entire digital transformation life cycles, beginning with digital strategy, software evaluation and selection, all the way through and including implementation planning, implementation readiness, and the actual implementation itself. We're technology agnostic, so we only represent our clients' best interests. We do not represent software vendors. But having said that, we work very closely with software vendors, all the leading players that you can imagine we've worked with, both in helping clients evaluate and select them, but also in helping clients implement those solutions as well. So we have a very broad, objective, agnostic view of the market that is meant to really represent your interest as you go through your digital transformation. I also encourage you to scan this QR code right here to get access to our resource center. This resource center has a ton of information, a ton of ebooks that are free. You have access to top 10 software rankings, playbooks for how to make your project more successful, guides to change management, YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff that are going to help you through your digital transformation. So I encourage you to scan this QR code to get access to those resources. And please feel free to reach out to me directly to brainstorm ideas about your project. Even if it's just informally, you want to bounce around some ideas and get some informal advice, I'd be happy to spend some time with you. So feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. You can also find it in the description field of this video as well.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 228, the special government digital transformation episode. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And you can also view all past 200 plus episodes of this show by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com as well. We cover a lot in government and the private sector, so be sure to check out the podcast. If you haven't already, you can find that at transformationgroundcontrol.com. So we're here with a panel discussion talking about the big, massive $1 billion government failure in Canada. Let's jump back into the conversation. Yeah, and I think, one thing where I would say, in this case, SAAQ has a heavy dose of blame to take is the lack of planning and preparation up front. Because if you let the fox into the hen house, so to speak, too soon, then okay, the fox came in the hen house and killed all the hens, whatever, killed all the animals. yeah, the fox, shame on the fox, but shame on you for letting the fox in too soon. And so, in this case, if they would have taken the time to do due diligence up front and to do phase zero, and for those of you that are wondering what phase zero means and the things that we mean by phase zero, download this checklist right here. QR code, top left side of your screen. We'll include links below. But if you scan that checklist, that gives you some guidance or things to think about that you should be doing during the project. And I would guess if SAAQ were to go through this checklist here, they probably would have found, we'd probably find that they didn't do a lot of that. So, coming back to you, Marcus, what are your thoughts here? Fox guarding the hen house. How does that factor into these cases, and how does it affect legal liability? In other words, is it if I let the fox in the hen house, I bring in the vendors too soon and I haven't done my own due diligence, and then the vendor takes advantage of me? Is that my fault or is it their fault? Is it both? Like, what's your take there?
Well, I think somebody said it a little bit ago. I mean, there's fault everywhere, right, for doing that. And I think that's to your point. But from a legal perspective, certainly, I mean, if you've got someone that's motivated by the billable hour that is basically running your project and managing it for you, with very little input from you, that is a recipe for disaster. And that is a common theme in the lawsuits that we will litigate, where the customer didn't take on enough responsibility, they didn't have enough due diligence on the front end, and they really did rely on that vendor to manage that project, to figure out what the requirements are. And it's easy to point the blame at a customer for doing that, but you have to understand that these projects are sold by salespeople that are motivated by getting the revenue into the company, meeting their goals, going to President's Club, whatever it is, and they are notorious for minimizing the complexity of these projects, minimizing the length of the project, telling you that they've got industry best practices baked into this, that it's going to be smooth, and you have to look at that with a high level of skepticism. I mean, if somebody is telling you, "Hey, this is going to be easy. We can do this within months. This software is designed for your industry. It's incorporating all your industry best practices in there." It's just not true. It just isn't. And you've got to push back on that. And I think a lot of people don't do that, and they take that at face value, and then that perpetuates the problem because you think, "Oh, this is going to be easy. I don't need to devote as many resources as I thought I was going to because I'm on this fast track to implementation, and we'll just sit back and let the vendor do what they do." And now you're in a multi-million-dollar failure.
Right. And go ahead, Ron.
Sorry, I just wanted to tag on to what Marcus was saying there. That comes back again to, I think we can't, as the clients, just say, "Here, consulting firm X, it's your job, go do it, tell me when it's done." They will do that. They absolutely will do that. They're more than happy to send you invoices monthly. That doesn't give you and your organization any time to A, understand what's changing about your business process, and B, prepare for that change and bring the organization into readiness for that kind of major change in your business. So now you've got the solution. Let's just assume they do it right and it's absolutely perfect, the best solution ever possible. But you got an organization who knows nothing about, again, set yourself up for failure in that we do things the older way. We're trying to learn how to do it the new way. It's day zero. We're going live. We've got customers and we don't know how to do it. You've got to, again, bring the organization and the project together and bring them along at more or less the same speed, so you don't end up with that huge disconnect in human capability versus technical capability.
Yeah. Go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, I mean, all of that is, Marcus and Ron just said is spot on. I mean, 100%. Here's what is amazing to me, right? So knowing that there was just this vacuum of preparation, basically, like whatever was done during that year was probably more bureaucratic in nature than, really functionally or technically deep and focused on what the solution should be. I can envision high level scope statements or, outcomes that they wanted to realize, but not really any analysis of how to get there. So you go through, there's like a couple phases of this project. The first phase was called like delivery 1. And it looks like that was installation of basic finance, admin, and HR functionality. So and it looks like they sailed through that. So my guess is that's just out of the box. Let's install this baseline ERP functionality. And delivery 2 is where you start getting into the bespoke custom requirements around the actual functional solution. And what's amazing is within like a year, they ran through and ran over the full budget for kind of that delivery to development phase. And at that point, that was in like 2020. So, at that point, you had a raging red flag waving in front of you. And instead of, and this is where the whole concept of this sunk cost fallacy comes into play, and people get caught up in, the politics and the culture and the outside, viewpoints of how you're going to be viewed if this is a failure. Well, the project had failed at that point. Basically, that was an abject failure. But instead, they doubled down. They went back for more money. They did it in a way that they didn't have to go all the way to the top of the hierarchy for oversight and approval. And all of a sudden, the status reports, you were talking about status reports earlier, earlier on, they were like red and yellow, and there was, it was a rainbow. Then they went green for 3 years straight. And so I just had voices in my head with, I could picture being the customer and the vendors telling me, don't worry, we'll catch up. We'll be able to get there. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. And it's like green, green, green. And it was just digging the hole deeper and deeper and deeper. And so, okay, great. Mea culpa, you totally missed the boat on preparation. You should have invested, 1 or 2 years and $25 million in getting it right and understanding what you needed to do for data remediation and integrations and functionality and figuring out how to build it and how to select vendors and the whole 9 yards. You had a point a year and a half in to say, hey, this is a complete debacle. We dropped the ball. And I think that's the key point of demarcation, where when you get into the outside investigations, they're going to really hone in on that. And they're going to say, who decided to keep going and where did we starting to hide stuff?
Yeah. And there's so many, organizational and human behavior dynamics that go into this. I mean, it's a lot of times, even though we opened up with the whole corruption, fraud, the dramatic result here, but it usually in these cases, even the biggest failures we've seen, usually the intentions are good. It's just that they make some really bad decisions along the way, and the economic incentives and the human behavior, the CYA mentality kicks in. I guess, Ron, I'd be curious to hear from you. As a CIO, a lot of times you've got a bullseye on your back. You're going through a project like this, and it's like, if this project fails, Ron, it's on you. You're the CIO. Have you felt that before? And if so, how have you navigated that in your career?
Absolutely. I felt that every time we take on one of these projects. That's why my joke about CIO, it doesn't stand for Chief Information Officer. It stands for career is over. But
great line.
You always have the target on your back, because inevitably these projects are perceived as technology projects, right? I claim they're all business projects with a tech component, but nobody else sees it that way. I think the only way I've been able to handle it, and sometimes not as well as others, is you have to make sure you have the business owners, your peers, in the project with you, because again, you don't know what you don't know about their business process. They need to have that input, that visibility, that expertise, that skin in the game, so that when decisions need to be made, they already have the background information leading up to that. They're able to process the information you're giving them now. They're able to make the decisions relatively quickly and have it be a relatively high chance of being the quote unquote right decision. If you're trying to bring in your VP of, insurance in this particular case, and this is the first time they've encountered any information from the project, you have to bring them up all that way. Whereas if you've been having at least periodic status reports written, they've attended various status meetings, not every month, maybe quarterly, whatever it might be, but at least they've got some familiarity with what's going on. But at the end of the day, it comes back to the client organization of saying, we wanted to do this. We're having issues. How do we fix it? How do we contain it? And if it is deemed a quote unquote failure and we need to stop, then let's make that decision quickly. Let's not wait 2 years, 5 years, 8 years down the road. Let's make those decisions. As they say, fail fast, right? So that you minimize the bleeding and you get to a point where we can regroup and we can fix, or we can say, hey, that was just a bad idea.
Yeah.
The idea of having, though, your business partners with you as a CIO in that conversation is absolutely crucial, because I think somebody mentioned earlier selective memory. They'll all want to say, "Oh, that was an IT project and we had nothing to do with it," and yeah, fire him. So.
Right.
Eric, I pick up on something that Marcus said earlier. There's one consistent theme we see when we see bad projects is that customers didn't raise a red flag soon enough. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Most of them are psychological and emotional, I think. But we consistently, they don't object early enough, and they don't understand the appropriate escalation paths within the contract. And consequently, there's a lot, if you do wind up in litigation or arbitration, there's a lot of fuzz as to, well, you never told us you were unhappy. You kept paying the invoices. Yeah, but there was a meeting on May 3rd where I said I was unhappy. Well, where are the notes for that? And so on. Really always encourage customers to know those key escalation paths, and raise your hand if something doesn't feel right. And actually, don't be afraid to stop the project. As Scott, to your point, no one does that. Right. And you really need to. It's that sunk cost fallacy at work. And there's a certain amount of emotional blackmail that providers will do. They'll say, well, if you pause the project, I can't promise you'll get the same team back. Well, why would I want this team back? I'm stopping the project because it's a catastrophe. Right. Yep. So don't fall prey to that.
Yeah. It's a great point. And they're really good at, the better you feel, the more likely you are to keep the project going, keep the status quo, keep paying the invoices. But feeling good is different than being logical and rational and moderately skeptical, and owning the project too. Really, a lot of this comes down to ownership. I mean, you have to know that, look, this isn't going well. And I know you, Mr. or Mrs. Vendors, are saying that I should keep going as is, but I'm not going to. And we're going to call a timeout. We're going to reassess. We're going to revisit, that sort of thing. I want to get to a couple.
What we don't know either is, okay, they've got the system to a point of minimal viable functionality, but you can read in the report where certain of the expected drivers of ROI, I think something called twin billing, was supposed to deliver $246 million in ROI, was completely omitted late stage in the project. You don't really know what kind of glue guns and popsicle sticks this thing's functioning on today, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it could be quite fragile. And you look at the testing right at the end, and you can see where they were accumulating defects faster than they were fixing them, and they still went live without addressing critical testing from an end-to-end basis. I mean, they have multiple stages in this project to, in the Kanban world, stop the line and take some different approaches.
Why do you think, Fred? Why do you think they went forward with it? That's a great point that Scott just made, but we've seen this a lot in expert witness cases and other project failures that will help recover. It's just sort of like you plow ahead, you jump off the cliff and go. I mean, what is it that leads to that?
I don't know. I can't tell exactly what the problem was here, but in other cases, we've seen the pressure from the vendor. There's definitely a deployment philosophy out there in ERP that says, just put it into production and we'll clean it up later. Right, this sort of crash landing approach philosophy, which is extremely painful operationally, obviously, to the organization. That might have been the philosophy here. Sometimes, frankly, it's just fear and shame on the part of the program management and sponsorship. We don't want to admit to our superiors that we're late again. We're going to have to reschedule again, move the deadline again. It's embarrassing. I might lose my job. That might have been the case here too. In this particular case, we've got clues, at least, that the upper management of the agency didn't like to receive bad news, right? There's clues in the auditor's report that internal auditors who tried to raise red flags in 2023 were treated pretty abusively by the CEO. So maybe that's an indicator it wasn't the kind of organization you want to convey bad news up the chain.
Yeah, it wasn't. Criticism.
I was just going to say that for that last point, Fred, that's pretty huge. And something that I experience frequently in our interaction with clients is, we'll be dealing with, let's call them boots on the ground line managers that, are maybe a level or two levels away from the C-suite where the decisions are being made and driven. They can oftentimes see the train wreck from afar getting ready to happen. And they're struggling, right? Because on one side, it's like, I have my job. I can't go and completely rattle the organization and make a fuss, but I also want to do the responsible thing and give fair warning, right? And so there is a level of abstraction above that. There's a number of things that could be driving the reasoning for these decisions, but it seems like a lot of times the middle management is unable to have accessibility. Yep. And to be able to speak openly and be heard, which could really head off a lot of these disasters, or allow the organization to course correct in a way to get to a better result with versus the approach that they are currently taking.
We do see that pattern an awful lot. There's people within the organization, either in the IT organization or people in business areas who've been through significant projects before in other jobs, and they'll raise doubts and realize it's not a safe environment for pursuing those doubts. And in this case, they actually had a governance structure put in place, one element of it that made sense. They had occasional drop-ins, it appears, from third-party consultants who would take a look at the project. And it appears from the auditor's report that these third-party consultants expressed doubts over and over and over again, and they were ignored. And so they had all kinds of opportunity, back to your point, to stop this thing and recalibrate it, and chose to ignore that advice, up to the point where they decided to plow ahead with going live, even though the testing wasn't complete and integrations hadn't been tested.
Yeah. And once you guys are bringing up a really good point, internal politics and culture can certainly affect these sorts of projects, and it has nothing to do with the technology. That's a much bigger issue, way below the surface of the iceberg. But one thing that we've seen, Fred, and I'm curious, Scott, I don't know if you may not see it as much just because of your, we have different business models, but I'm curious to hear from the two of you. One thing I know, Fred, you and I have heard at third stage is, you go into a situation like SAAQ, we're independent, we're third party, we come in with our assessment and we point out the things that need to be fixed. And then you get the vendor, a lot of times they'll say, yeah, but third stage is independent, they're tech agnostic, they're not SAP experts like we are, even though we've done a million SAP projects. Okay, yeah, we're not representing SAP, we're not selling SAP, but we are SAP experts. But they'll create this perception that, well, they're independent, they're agnostic, we're the real experts in SAP, and we're telling you everything's fine. Have you, what are your thoughts on that, Fred? Or have you seen that before? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. And the problem is never the specific technology being deployed. These are generic problems involved in implementing technology. And they're the exact same problems we've been struggling with literally since the 80s, I think, maybe probably before that, right? They're the same generic issues we face again and again. It has nothing to do whether it's SAP or Infor or whatever.
Yeah, it's hey, trust me. When I hear anything akin to that, then I need some backup, right? In jest, I mean, I was kind of reading through this report and I wondered, I wonder if at some point SAP came in with a RISE proposal at the later stages of this thing. I mean, right. It's right. Like you've given the keys to the castle to the vendor, and I struggle to understand why organizations put that level of trust into their vendors, right? I mean, this is a business partnership, and it's something that you need to make sure that you have your interests taken care of and looked at, and you cannot expect your technology vendor and your system integrator to help manage the business process mapping, the change management, the project management, everything that goes along with keeping these projects on track. And so yeah, I mean, frequently when you're hip deep into a project and whoever the vendor is tells you, it's okay, we'll figure it out by the end. I have a sense that was something happening towards the latter stages on this project. You're like, I think to your point, Fred, the psychological pressure, right? You've spent hundreds of millions of dollars. You're in the middle of this project. You've got a lifeline. The vendor's giving you a lifeline. We'll get you there. It's okay. Very easy to take that and grab a hold of it. And I can really empathize with people in that position, facing those choices. It's not an easy position to be in.
Yeah. You need someone there on your team that can not tell you it's okay, we'll get you there, and lead you right through the landmine. You need someone that says, yeah, it's going to be okay, but watch that landmine. Let's go around it instead of walking right through it. And that's really the way we've got to view it. Here's a opportunity for a shameless plug for you and I, Fred. So Someone on LinkedIn says, could an independent quality assurance in ERP be of help? Yes. In fact, funny you should ask. It can be. And in fact, I'll put up the free assessment QR code again if you want a kind of an opinion on any of this stuff. We're happy to do that for you with no charge there. And then a couple other comments here. Whoops, just lost the chat. There it is. Here's another question for, we're talking a lot about an extreme failure. You look at this now and you say, obviously, this is a huge failure. I mean, for God's sake, the corruption police are showing up at our doorstep. Obviously, something's wrong. It was very clear this is a big, massive failure. But most failures aren't this big. I mean, most failures are like the bigger risk, I think, are those moderate failures, those ones that are super painful, bring the operations to its knees for a couple weeks, and then sure, maybe eventually everything's okay. But they didn't need to go through all that heartache and cost and risk and all that stuff. So Megan on YouTube says, what are the key things you've seen that's an indicator of where the project failed or started to fail, and at what stage do you see them most? So in other words, what are those indicators of failure other than the government, the anti-corruption squad showing up at your doorstep and people getting fired and sued and all that stuff? Assuming we don't want to wait until that point, how do you know prior to that there's failure brewing under the surface? What are your thoughts? I'll start with you. How about you, Marcus? I'll start with you since you see a lot of these train wrecks too.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see them when, we do an evaluation. We use somebody like your team to do that evaluation, a deep dive into everything that's happened. And it's really, I think where enough resources aren't devoted to the project, that's certainly one indicator that the project is at risk. I think unrealistic project status reports, certainly where everything is green. I think you were saying that earlier. And one of the things that somebody said that resonated with me is, when did you start hiding stuff, and whose decision was it to keep going forward? And there's always a tipping point, and that's a pretty good summation of where the tipping point is, right? It's where you understand that the resources that you have to devote to this thing to get it to just the minimally viable product, that's kind of where you're at. And I think that's certainly, an indication where this thing is not going where it should. It's going off the rails. That's when people come to me, and we tell them, two things. We say, look, litigation is expensive. It's going to cost, probably as much as you've devoted to the project to date to take this thing all the way to a trial, and the outcome is uncertain. And you should devote as much time and energy as you can to get this thing right-sided so that you have a product that ultimately works for you. And those are the two directions that you're going to go. If you're faced with, I've lost confidence in the vendor, we can't keep going on, we can't keep throwing good money after bad, and if that's the decision, we can't keep throwing good money after bad, then I think litigation and trying to negotiate a resolution and get a new vendor or a new product is one of the ways to go. But that's not an easy process. And I think, trying to get that product to get to work for you is usually preferable.
Yeah, absolutely. So Michael on YouTube says, all the issues revolve around poor documentation, inconsistent project structure and approval process, change management, success or failure. So that's an interesting observation. And I tend to agree with you here. Here's a use case or case study that is not going to fit on the screen, but I'll read it anyway. This is from Ed on LinkedIn. Ed says, my company is going through a digital transformation, and he uses digital transformation in quotes, which I'm curious to, I think you're suggesting something here. The first thing I did was gather this subject matter experts and broke down our business model, then built a wants needs list to get a better view of what we need to get going. Based on this list, we went through an extensive vendor discovery phase to find the best fit for our business. We are currently in the early implementation phase of our new infrastructure, and this really helped our vendor understand our business in order to reduce the plan design phase and focus more on building constructing phase. So interesting perspective from Ed on LinkedIn. So thanks for that. And if you ever want to brainstorm ideas on your project, Ed, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to chat with you about that. But that's interesting. And I think, one thing I'd say too, coming back to this phase zero thing, and I'll put up our phase zero checklist again in case you missed it the first time. The QR code will be on the top of your screen. But when you do that phase zero and that preparation, that planning up front that Ed is talking about, a lot of times clients, and back to this human organizational behavior, a lot of times clients think, well, if I spend this much time doing planning and preparation, that's this much time that I lost on building all the stuff I need to build. So what if we just don't do that? We'll speed things up and we'll start now. And it's sort of like they feel like because it's taking this long to get to where you even start designing and building and touching and feeling and seeing stuff, they feel like they're delaying things. But what we find is when you spend the time up here sort of building that foundation and letting the cement dry, and then you go start building the house, it just speeds things up so much more. Whereas if you don't pour the foundation, you don't let the cement dry, and then you start building stuff. Okay, yeah, you did technically speed things up in the short term, but long term, the whole thing is going to come crashing down. So get the foundation in place, speed things up. It's actually going to cost you a lot less time and money if you take that time up front, as Ed is suggesting there. So that's a great point. So thanks for that, Ed. There was another point here about public versus private sector. Let me come back to that. While I'm looking for it, here's a comment from Kavina on LinkedIn. Hi, Eric and everyone. Thank you for this discussion. 100% Fred. This is an excellent point regarding ego, fear of reputation, being impacted, and reporting the truth to peers. And she liked your CIO comments, Ron, career ego. So you've struck a nerve out there. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Okay, so I don't see the name of the person on LinkedIn that's saying this, but this is a really good point, and I want to get into this. A common theme I hear from all of you in your thoughts is that you keep thinking with a private sector mentality. There's nothing against it, but here they were dealing with government. Different mentality, lots of politics behind, and also a lot of unionized people here that also don't want to change. And this is a really interesting point, and I'll start with you, Ron. What are your thoughts here? And I admittedly, I have more private sector experience. We do a lot of government work at Third Stage, but me personally, I have more private sector experience. I'm curious to hear what you think, Ron.
As someone who's been in the public sector for 20 plus years doing these kinds of projects, one thing, and both the private sector as well, the one thing that I think is extremely common across all of this is the larger the organization, the larger the project, the more political it is. It quite honestly doesn't matter as much as one might think, whether you're talking about a government project or a private sector project. The politics on the government side is different in that you're dealing with public money, taxpayer money generally. And so there's a little bit more emotional excitement attached to that on behalf of your constituents, as should be. And you're dealing with election cycles that honestly people in the private sector do not have to pay any attention to. That can exacerbate any of the issues that you might run into in a project. To just address the union thing for a moment, I've been in private sector organizations where we had union issues. Yes, it's much more prevalent in government, but it's not exclusive to government. But that really gets, I think, to the point where it's part of phase 0 and it's part of your ongoing change management process. You have to include your bargaining units, your unions as key stakeholders, even though they may not officially be the business owner. They own the resources, for lack of a better word, that get your work done. And you have to bring them along just as much or even more than you have to bring along the individual people doing the work day to day. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to end up in litigation, having to call on Marcus to defend or take Marcus on. You also don't want to be in a situation where you've got labor issues. You've got a meet and confer. You've got a more contentious complaint that you have to deal with because you didn't include those kinds of things. So while I think it's true that government is a little bit unique, I think it's also more common than most people would realize and immediately appreciate. But again, getting back to that election cycle and the taxpayer piece, to me, that argues even more adamantly, more strongly for let's break this up. Let's take this in smaller risk increments, because when it goes bad, it goes really bad, really quick, and it's just a mess, and nobody wants to deal with that. If we can say we're going to spend, instead of $500 million as they started with, if we're going to spend $50 million and we're going to do these 1 or 2 or 3 things and see how that goes. If that works, great. If not, we'll adjust. Okay, now instead of spending $50 million, we're going to spend $45 million and we're going to try and do this one thing. Taking that 10-year window of project, as they tried to do, and breaking that into a program with multiple projects within it, I think in a government space is really the only viable way to manage that extra risk, that extra layer of risk.
Yeah, that's a great point and great way to put it. And you do, I think the bigger issue here is, it's really important to understand who you are and what you're dealing with. You're culturally, politically, organizationally.
Right.
And it's not just, are you public sector or private sector? Even within the public sector, within the private sector, you've got different cultures, different politics, different gamesmanship that's happening internally and drivers and all that stuff. And that is a big part of what change management can help with. But honestly, you won't hear me say this often, but I feel like change management might have been the least of the problems here on this, just because there were so many things pre-change management that were just so fundamentally wrong with the project to begin with that I don't know that any amount of change management could have fixed this, which I hate to say because I love change management. I'm a huge believer in it, obviously, but I don't think that would have helped, but I don't think it would have fixed the problems here. I want to get to this. I want to get a knee-jerk reaction to this question because I have a very strong reaction to this, but I want to see what you guys think. And I'm gonna start with you, Fred, as a independent consultant, not only as an expert witness perspective, but also as someone who helps guide clients through the selections and implementations. But the question here is from Phil on YouTube. He says, "How do you select vendor number 2 after vendor number 1 fails?" What's your knee-jerk reaction to that, Fred? I just want to see what your thoughts are.
I think it's good to take a pause and do a brief retrospective on what went wrong. Be honest with yourselves on, if you're the customer, be honest with yourself on your complicity in the problem, right? What you could have done better, and learn some lessons from it, and then just apply those to another selection. I do agree, it may sound self-serving, but I do agree that you should bring in a selection firm or someone independent to help you guide that, to kind of take some of the emotion out of it. Whereas you might have been too trusting the first time around, now you're going to be too suspicious, right? That you're going to see monsters under every bed. So it's probably, I would bring in somebody to help guide you through that process, but learn lessons from the first time. Try to be dispassionate about it, and maybe take a break before you move into the second one. Let the dust settle a little bit.
Yeah, that was my thought too, that's the last thing you should be doing, is saying, okay, well, let's go find another vendor. We had the very first expert witness case I was ever involved with was one that was very large, very well known, not quite as big as this one. I think it was like a $700 or $800 million failure, which is still massive and excessive. But in that case, they had the organization, it was a big manufacturing company. They had they tried to implement PeopleSoft, and they had a big, massive failure. And they went into litigation with PeopleSoft. They settled. And then they just went straight to SAP and said, all right, well, we've got 2 options. We're a huge company. We either, at this time, this is before Oracle and Microsoft D365 were really viable options at the time, or at least for larger organizations. So they said, well, we already tried PeopleSoft. Now I guess we're going to SAP. And they didn't do an evaluation. They just went straight to SAP. That led to the failure that they hired me as the expert witness for. And in fact, one of my points in the report was that they just went straight from PeopleSoft to SAP and did the exact same things over. And guess what? You changed the vendor, but it didn't change the results because you ran it the exact same way. In that case, unfortunately, the judge actually struck that part of my report. I couldn't talk about the PeopleSoft failure from the past because it was not related, in his opinion, to this case, but in my opinion, it was. But I think that's something you have to watch, is not just assume that the vendor's the problem and go find a new vendor and move on. So I want to do this just as sort of a wrap up here to sort of summarize and bring this all back full circle. I want to ask each of you, just what advice would you give to someone who's trying to avoid failure or remediate projects? What's that single, couple things that you would suggest that clients do if they're worried about failure, if they worry they might be failing or they are failing, whatever stage they're in? What can they do to mitigate risk and avoid situations like this? I'll start with you, Scott.
Well, I think a lot of the things we've already talked about, right? I mean, to me, the biggest thing that's overlooked is the upfront planning and preparation and factoring that into the total cost of ownership of the project. I think there's an enormous pressure when someone has this idea, or they get an idea that's greenlit, and they go to this funding committee with a high level number that hasn't really been vetted in detail. Instead, go and ask for, like Ron was saying, break it up into chunks. Hey, we want some money allocated to go through this planning and specification development process. Let's look at what our problem, statement is versus what the solution sets look like in the marketplace. What do those requirements really look like? What's it going to take for us to, really do the remediation phases before we even get to something where we're developing the solution in most cases? I think that, it's politically difficult to kind of push through because the pressure to start the project seems to be enormous. If you can forestall that pressure to start and take time to plan, your budgets are going to be, much more accurate. I think, if you have a really good planning process, maybe you need that 20% contingency over your budget because your things are going to change, requirements are going to change. There's always the unknowns. But if you're not doing that, you need to plan for 100 to 150% of your budget variance. And so you really need to think about, are you going to be around at the end of this project because your name's going to be associated with that overage. It's almost guaranteed if you don't do the planning, you're going to get hit with that.
Yeah. How about you, Ron? What's your takeaway? Your summary advice, last words to the audience here from a CIO perspective.
As someone who's had to deal with this, don't skip phase 0. It is the absolute critical piece. To build on a building metaphor, you got to have your foundation in before you start putting up your walls and your roof and things like that. Without that, it doesn't matter what else you do. So phase 0 is absolutely critical. And I think the other piece, and this I've learned sometimes the hard way, you really do have to pay attention to the organizational culture, the organizational politics, for lack of a better word, and really build in ample time for change management. You may want to call it something different. Sometimes there's an emotional reaction to the word change management. But you've got to be able to bring the project deliverables forward at the same pace as your organization is able to absorb them. Otherwise, you get in the desert, we call it the flash floods, right? Because it rains so much the ground can't absorb it. You don't want to put your organization through that same process.
Good advice. How about you, Fred? What's your parting advice?
Certainly endorse everything said already, but I'd say a couple things. Raise your hand when you're feeling uncomfortable at something. Know the escalation procedures in the contract. I know that we probably like reading contracts more than most normal people do, but know the escalation path and use it. And don't compromise on your stage gate criteria. If you set up stage gate criteria that say you're going to complete all the testing successfully before you go live or go into UAT or whatever, do it. Don't compromise on those things. And the thing I say to a lot of clients when they find themselves in difficult situations is, I know you hired these people because they're experts and you're not, but trust your instincts. You're probably right.
Right. Yeah. Great advice. How about you, Marcus?
Well, it's really three things. And the first is have reasonable expectations. Know what you're getting yourself into. Don't believe the hype from the sales team and the vendors. Then I would say you've really got to document your business requirements. Anything that is critical and any kind of critical piece of functionality that is a reason for that digital transformation, or you engaging that particular company moving away from your legacy system has to be documented in the contract. And the final thing really is use that contractual negotiation process to put a good, solid contract that functions as a governance document for the life cycle of your relationship with that vendor, so that when something does go sideways, you can pull that contract out of a drawer. You can point to Section 5, Clause 3, and say, this is what's supposed to happen. You need to do this. We need to do this, and understand the contractual escalation. So that to me is really giving yourself an opportunity for success.
Yeah, and if I'm being totally proactive in thinking about worst case scenario, I'm recording, especially the AI now, transcription services and technology record every meeting, especially in the sales cycle. I mean, if you record that stuff, document it. I had a client on this podcast, one of our clients, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, named Seth, and he was on, and he was talking about how he had over 1,000 recordings of every meeting that with the vendors, with us, as his consulting partner. He had it all documented. He had recordings of it all. And I thought that's really smart. And they're nowhere near litigation. I mean, everything went fine. But, not only does it help you manage the project better, but in the, God forbid, the case you end up in litigation, you've got all this stuff documented, and that's just going to help you, especially if you need to hire someone like Marcus.
It really does.
All right. Good stuff. Thanks, guys. That was really good. Love the conversation. And we're going to shift gears here in a moment. And when we come back, we're actually going to invite Ron back on. He's going to be on, just he and I. Ron was the CIO that was on the panel just now. We're going to bring him on to talk about just him specifically from a CIO perspective. What are some of the lessons learned and takeaways from his 25 plus years of leading government modernization efforts over the years? So we'll take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I'm excited to announce the release of our 2025 Digital Transformation Report. It's available now on the Third Stage Consulting website, www.thirdstage-consulting.com. This report gives you an unbiased, technology-agnostic insight to help you optimize your organization's projects for success. Get your copy today using the QR code in front of me or on our website.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 228. This is the special government digital transformation episode. We're covering everything related to government, the good, the bad, the ugly, the things you need to know, some lessons learned, all that good stuff. So we're happy you're here. And that conversation we just had, the panel discussion, there were three things. I took 3 notes here as we were talking, and there was just tons of lessons learned. I mean, dozens of takeaways that a lot of them, were new to me, and it was great learning from such a broad, diverse group. But the 3 things that really jumped out at me is, one is this whole Ron's comment that CIO doesn't just stand for Chief Information Officer, it stands for career is over. I know he was being half funny, but half serious, because there is a big bullseye on CIOs. But I think the good news is if you manage these projects appropriately and you have the right support, companies like Third Stage helping you that are agnostic, they've done this a million times, those organizations are going to be the ones that succeed. And that takes a lot of the pressure off of you as a CIO to where it's not all just you. And it shouldn't just be you, because after all, these are not business, or these are not IT projects, they're business projects. So there's no reason that the pressure should always be on the CIO, even though that is the reality. So that was a really interesting point. I love the thread about decision latency and how making decisions or slow decisions are one of the biggest things that slow down a project. I don't think I mentioned it when I was chatting with Scott and the others on the panel about this, but in that Standish Group research that he referred to, if you remember, he was talking about Standish Group put out a report called the Chaos Report. In that report, that's where they talk about decision latency. And I did have someone from Standish Group, and he's a professor in Belgium, and his name is Hans Mulder. And he was on my podcast several months ago, and he talked about research that he's done, very extensive research, by the way. It's over 100,000 ERP use cases in all sectors. And they quantitatively analyzed what went wrong, what were the biggest challenges. And he said that the number one contributor to failure was decision latency. So that whole issue of not being able to make decisions quick enough was one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge. And then the third takeaway I had from this conversation is that it's really no one person's fault when these projects fail. I mean, it's easy to point blame at a CIO or at the software vendor, or the system integrator, maybe the project manager or the project team, whatever. There's so many people to blame. In this case, there's just so many things went wrong that there's plenty of blame to go around. But I think at the end of the day, the way I look at this is someone has to step up and say, we are going to have a single point of accountability. And I know it's hard in government and public sector entities because in the United States, for example, we're a democratic government and you vote and there is no autocracy. There's no, we're not communists. We're not total command and control in most cases. So there's a need or a want to, and a cultural component where it's sort of it's a democracy in the way the government operates, not just in terms of how people get elected, but how the government works day to day. And so that piece of it is really, that's a challenging part because it's harder, I think, for government entities in some cases to step up and say, hey, this person is ultimately responsible and this person will make the final decision, or they'll be the arbitrator of what the right decision is for us. Or at the very least, we'll have this committee that meets every so often to make the final decisions, and you just have to sort of deal with it, even if you don't like that decision. So I know it's hard, easier said than done, but that's something that's worth noting. And one thing that I couldn't help but think about during this conversation is, you think about, we're a lot of us are viewing this from a North American or a Western European government structure. That's the traditional democracy. But I start to think about, what about other types of governments, like the autocracies or the communist governments, where there's more of a top-down and command and control approach to running the government. And I'm not here to talk politics, but I am here to talk about effective structures for making decisions. And I often wonder if you could compare the two, if you could do a study that says, how do the more democratic governments, how do they make decisions and how quickly are they able to move and how effective can they be in going through these transformations versus, a different type of government structure. I'd love to hear your feedback. What are your thoughts? That might be, I don't mean that to be too controversial of a topic, but I do think it's worth noting. And I'd also love to hear from you, what are some of the biggest challenges you've seen on your digital transformation efforts or your past IT efforts at your government agency? I'd love to hear your thoughts below. So all that being said, I want to shift gears now and bring on Ron Puccinelli again. He was just on the panel a moment ago, and he was the guy that was talking about things from the government CIO perspective. And I thought it'd be great to have him on to talk more deeply, or just go into more detail about the CIO's perspective in government transformations. With all that being said, we're going to roll the clip that actually interviewed with him just a few weeks ago. I had him on this same podcast. So we want to replay that for you here in the context of this government episode. So let's roll the clip here with Ron and I talking about lessons from government ERP implementations. You've straddled between public sector and private sector. You've done both. How did you end up in getting involved with ERP implementations in government entities?
Well, I started off in the private sector in the more traditional business world, being around ERPs, doing ERPs there. During the whole .com experience, if any of the audience can remember that far back, that was one of my bigger tasks, was doing those for several startups. And then that just transitioned into when the government space started catching up and saying, oh, we need to update our financial systems. We want to do ERP. Well, I've done those. So guess what? You get to do it again. A lot of the lessons cross. There are some unique nuances, but they're not showstoppers. So it really is interesting how, regardless of what industry you're in, what public or private or anything like that, the the lessons, the work remains the same. A computer's a computer. It doesn't know what it's doing.
Right. And you need humans to tell it what it should be doing. And
Absolutely.
we'll get into a lot of that here in a second as it relates to more the human component of it. So how does implementing an ERP system in government differ, though? I know you're saying a computer is a computer. You need to, it doesn't know what to do. You need the human element to deploy it. And so much of what we're going to talk about today I don't want to say has nothing to do with government, but it's sort of like these are universal principles in many ways. But in general, setting that aside for a moment, how are government ERP implementations different? And what are some of the biggest challenges you've seen in the public sector versus the private sector?
Sure. I think there are three main areas where there is some difference. First of those obviously starts at the beginning of the process, the procurement cycle. In government, by definition, we have to be a lot more rigorous because we're spending taxpayer money, not our own money. So that process tends to be a little bit lengthier, tends to be a little bit more detailed. I wish I could tell you it's always been better, but not always. It really comes down to you want to make sure that you're putting in your request for proposal or your solicitation, or even just when you're asking a vendor, if you're on the private side, you want to make sure that they're looking at and focusing on the way you and your business work, not so much on here's what our system does. You want to make them respond to and demonstrate how they can support your business, your unique value add to your processes. On the implementation side, on the government side of space, we follow a concept called fund accounting. You might run into this in the nonprofit space a little bit as well. Kind of correlates also to grants. But in that sense, it's from the private side of the world, it would be like a separate company. Each fund would be its own company, and you're not allowed to mix funds and things like that across. So making sure that your system can support the principles and concepts of fund accounting. That's where a lot of folks will tend to focus on an ERP system that's more crafted, more aimed at the government market space. But you can use, and I've actually done 2 or 3 of these, you can use a private sector specific product, ERP product, to do fund accounting. You just have to work within the constraints of what it has. And I think lastly, the biggest difference is how fast the rate of change, the rate of absorption in your organization. And that's always a tricky balance. You don't want to push something through so fast that people can't adjust to it. And you definitely do not want to leave the people out of it. The people are going to be using the system, both, the heads down, HR, finance kinds of folks, as well as the more casual other departments who they need to use it, but they don't need to know every little detail about how everything works. You want to make sure that you're implementing at a pace that they can absorb, they can adjust, and also that works the way they like to work, the way as much as you can. The way they think about how things work. So I think those are probably the 3 biggest things. And in the government side of space, on that last people one, there's a lot more attention that needs to be paid to how are we getting our teams ready for this. In the private sector, it's easy for the CEO or somebody to get up and say, this is what we're doing, questions, great, but we're still doing it. It's not always that straightforward in the government space. Again, because we're spending other people's money, because we have to answer for how we're using taxpayer money, we have to be a little bit more thorough, a little bit more diligent in that process.
Yeah, and you have so many different stakeholders you're answering to, and there's political forces,
very much so,
public perception forces, all these sorts of things that the private sector just doesn't have to deal with. And I imagine that it's just going to slow things down, right? I mean, you're just not going to be able to make the command and control decisions faster, like a private sector in theory could, even though I would argue a lot of private sector organizations have the same problem, but for different reasons. But that is a big challenge, I imagine. I want to come back to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
It can be a challenge, yes.
I'm gonna pull on a couple threads that you just mentioned because you hit some really good points there. But first, I want to turn to the audience real quickly just to say hello to some people that are chiming in here on the various platforms. Want to say hello to Troy, who's joining from Lubbock, Texas. Thanks for being here today, Troy. We've got Lucien from Aruba. It sounds really nice about now. We've got Spring Fever. Aruba just sounds like a nice place right now. I mean, I've been, and it is a nice place, but right about now it sounds good. Darian joining on LinkedIn. Good morning. Thanks for being here. And then Living Your Best Life says hello as well. So thanks everyone for joining here today. And wherever you're joining from, if you don't mind, just drop in the chat any questions you have along the way, anything that comes to mind or any comments you have. Try to make this as engaging as possible. Now, before I just introduced some of our audience members here a moment ago, you talked about fund accounting and how that's different than the private sector. And I guess that sort of touches on an even bigger question or issue, which is the whole concept of understanding what's unique about your industry or your organization that you can't change or you shouldn't change, you don't want to change. And I don't mean it like we're resistant to change sort of thing, but more this is just who we are and this is our industry, or in the private sector, it might be this is our competitive advantage, and not every off-the-shelf software is going to be able to do what you said. So how did you, in the case of fund accounting, how did you navigate that and other nuances that are somewhat unique to government, and how did that affect your transformation?
Sure. Let me just briefly touch on what I mean by fund accounting, make sure we're starting on the same page, essentially. So in fund accounting, in government space, we have things like a general fund, which is unrestricted use. You can use that money for anything you want. Then you've got things like gas tax, which can only be used for streets and transportation kinds of things. And you've got other restricted funding sources that can only be used for those particular things. That's what I mean by fund accounting.
Right.
So that all goes back to in the beginning when you're doing your selection process, your solicitation process, you want to clearly identify what are those kinds of requirements. In the case of government space, fund accounting is not optional. It's legally required. We can't change it even if we wanted to. It's just the way the law says we have to do things. So it's not optional. And as much as I like working for government and doing these projects, I'm not going to go to jail for doing one of them.
Right.
But and that's again where it gets back to, you want to make sure that you're requiring the vendors proposing for your system, make sure that they're addressing those specific needs that are unique, that are your value add, or that are your specific industry and legal requirements. Don't let them just say, hey, we got all these bells and whistles. Isn't this cool? Well, yeah, that's cool. But how do you do these things that we really, really need to make sure we have it done? As I mentioned, some of the, like the SAPs or the Oracle systems or any of the other more private sector focused systems, they can do fund accounting. They just happen to call it a separate company. The concepts are the same. In company A, they have their revenue, they have their expenses, etc. Company B has its, and they don't mix. That's fund accounting. It's just in the context of the system, they call it a company. That can be difficult for government folks to wrap their head around, but it's not insurmountable.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of those nuances are things that can create risk and delays and uncertainty in a project, and that's the stuff you really have to dig into and understand, and not gloss over or treat like every other business requirement you might have. Because, like you said, you don't want to go to jail, and because there's certain things you have to do from a regulatory perspective, and you have no choice. And so it's not enough for the software vendor to say, well, we have best practices built into our software. Well, no, you don't. If I'm going to go to jail because your software doesn't do what I need it to, then that's not best practice. And same with the private sector too. There's going to be core competitive advantages that certain organizations have that the software can't do. And so that stuff, or that tension between what you need and what the software can do, first of all, you're never going to have a full alignment, 100% fit. So that small percentage of the small exceptions that don't fit, that's what causes delays and sometimes overruns on these projects. Have you seen that before, where like that where you get hung up on the project?
Very, very much so, particularly in the private sector, in the several I've done over there. And you made a really interesting point there, Eric, where um, you want to make sure that yes, you're not going to get 100% of everything you want out of a particular system, but make sure that your unique value add, whether you're in government or in the private sector, make sure that those things are included in the capabilities of the system. You don't want to change your business, give up your value proposition in order to implement an ERP system, because then you're not any different or any more valuable than any other of your competitors.
Yeah, definitely. Here's an interesting question or comment that I'm curious to hear what you think of this, Ron. This is from Carmen on LinkedIn. Hello, Carmen. Carmen says, then we have to take into account cybersecurity and FDIC regulations and regulatory technology. So,
yes,
what are your thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, today, cybersecurity is not something you can do as an afterthought. You really need to build that in. I would suggest baking it into your solicitation process. You want to understand if you're going with a cloud-based solution, which most of them are anymore, what are they going to do when they notice an issue? Will they tell you about it? Most vendors will try to not tell you about it. My own personal opinion on this is I want to know when something's affecting a system for which I and my organization are responsible. We've had some long discussions with various legal teams about that. Finally, we were able to get it in there. You also want to make sure that you understand who is responsible for handling the security. Is it the vendor? Is it you? Is it a partnership? Now, if you're going with a cloud-based solution, more than likely they will handle the back-end security for the hardware, the actual software, things like that. But it's still on you to make sure that permissions are correct, that user accounts are handled correctly, all of those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, you still want to make sure that it's clear who does what and what obligations each has to the other in terms of notifications and things like that. One of the things that is helpful is to make sure that you're getting their SAAQ audit report results, their letters from their SAAQ auditors. SAAQ type 1, type 2, type 1 being the moment in time, type 2 being their process over the review period. Those kinds of things will help you understand if they're being as thorough and diligent as they can be. And it also helps you with your cyber insurance, with your risk management on your side, to understand where your risk is and how much risk you're taking on when you agree to go with one of these systems. In terms of FDIC or any of the other regulatory requirements, and I've had to deal with FDIC, with FDA, with Food and Drug Administration, and several others. You definitely want to make sure that you understand what each of those bodies requires from you, and make sure that that's built into your reporting, into your organization, into your chart of accounts if necessary. And at the end, you also want to take into account the audit process. Are you doing an annual audit? In the government side of the space, we have to do something called an annual consolidated financial report, ACFR. That's where you roll everything up together and present it as a public document and say, across the fiscal year, this is how we spent the taxpayers' money. Some systems do that creation really well, some don't. You want to make sure you understand how that's going to work. You also want to make sure things like auditors, is there a way to have a specific audit type of account that has visibility but can't make changes in your system, as opposed to giving them full sysadmin rights to your system? So those kinds of nuances, and again, that doesn't matter whether you're on private or public. It's just things you need to pay attention to in your system.
Yeah, and that's you hit a few good points. In one in particular is that when you think of cybersecurity, oftentimes we think about hackers, getting into our network from the outside, and that obviously is a big threat. That's an increasing threat for public sector and private sector organizations. But there's also the you sort of talk about admin security rights, just your own internal employees and what kind of information that, or what sort of access they have, because there's a lot of non-criminal, non-nefarious types of security issues as well. Someone just doesn't understand, realize
Absolutely.
that they have access to something they shouldn't, or they somehow corrupt data they shouldn't be touching, that sort of thing. So there's more subtle, less criminal types of cybersecurity issues that are arguably just as important too, that you've got to think about. Not just are the hackers going to bust into our system or not?
Right. The internal threat, the employee, either intentional or unintentional, is perhaps even a bigger
Yeah.
threat.
Yeah. Good point. And just as a follow-up to that, Carmen had a follow-up here, or just a follow-up comment, I suppose it is. So Carmen said, as a follow-up to her question, also very important as someone who understands risk management, fraud prevention, understanding regulatory technology is key.
Absolutely.
So can't
Yeah.
forget about regulatory stuff, cybersecurity, fraud prevention, all that stuff may not be as sexy and cool as some of the other enterprise technology stuff we talk about, but it is something that has to be done as part of this. So
Absolutely true.
here's a really interesting question from Jeremy on LinkedIn. It looks like he's on LinkedIn. So Jeremy says the sponsor is a key role in any ERP implementation. And I'd say in the private sector, just to add to that, in the private sector, oftentimes you have the CFO or maybe the COO, sometimes the CIO, someone at that level, ideally from the business, though, someone who's more on the business operations side that can be involved is typically the sponsor. But from what role does a good government implementation sponsor come from? In other words, what are the typical sponsors or leaders within a government ERP implementation?
Excellent point. In my opinion, and I'm basing this on research and several years of experience, as well as Gartner Group and others talking about these kinds of things. There really are no technology projects. They're all business projects that rely on technology to get where they're going. From that perspective, personally, I believe you need to make sure that your sponsor is the CEO, the COO, the city manager, the assistant city manager, and maybe not. It could be the finance chief financial officer. It really should not be the CIO, the technical person. The last thing, I shouldn't say it that way. The one thing I want to try and avoid is IT said this is how we're going to do it. No, this is how the business needs to work. I need finance to tell me how they want their process to run. I need human resources to tell me how they want their processes to run. We all roll up and we all report up to somewhere there's a chief executive. That person needs to have bought into the need for the project, be supportive of executing the project, because without that support, it's easy for everybody to say, oh, well, this is just those people doing the things they want to do. It's not really important from an overall organization perspective. And that's where that sponsor is the super critical, in my opinion. You want to make sure that you've got the organizational gravitas, that top one or top two person behind you saying, yes, this is an important project. This is why it's important to us. And this is what we're doing. Doesn't mean you can't be feeding them all the information, ghostwriting essentially what's going on, but you need their clout in the organization, their weight in the organization behind you to make that work. And that's true in government, probably more true in government than any other of the businesses I've been in.
Yeah. Yeah. You need someone from the business side to be the face of the change. And you made an interesting comment that, I think or not every CIO, but I know a lot of CIOs, it sounds like maybe yourself included, where one of their biggest nightmares is, well, the CIO or IT said that we have to do it this way. And that is the last thing you want. Now, of course, technology has limitations, and there's certain, IT can't deliver everything that the business wants.
Right.
And so there might be limitations to what IT can deliver, but you shouldn't have IT defining how you're going to run your business and that sort of thing.
Right. We're not the business people. We're never going to know it as well as the people who do it all day, every day. And again, I don't want to be stuck in a position where, well, we can't do that line of business, or we can't run that mission critical process because IT won't let us. It's like, okay.
Yeah. That's interesting. Well, and just as a side note, a couple side notes I want to share here as we get to more questions from the audience. First of all, we're talking about a lot of lessons here from ERP projects. We actually have an ebook that's a good supplement to this discussion called Lessons from 1,000 ERP Implementations. We've taken and compiled our team's several hundred, over 1,000 different ERP implementation lessons and compiled it into an ebook. So you can scan this QR code right here on our screen for those that are watching this versus listening. And if you're listening, we'll also include a link in the chat or the notes below. But just scan that QR code that I'll leave up here for a second. You can download our guide to 1,000 ERP or lessons from 1,000 ERP implementations. Secondly, another sort of fun fact is you are actually in the market looking for a new CIO role. So if anyone out there is looking for a CIO or knows someone who's looking for a CIO, either in the public sector or on the private sector side, Ron's a good guy. He's been a client of ours 2 different times now. So we'd love to get the word out that he's available for hire. So so be sure to connect with Ron on LinkedIn if you're not already. And we've tagged him in this post too. So go to LinkedIn. You'll find his profile there. You can connect with him. But I want to get to another comment here that this is from Darian on LinkedIn. And the question here from Darian is, you mentioned public sector projects inherently moving slower than private sector ones. What are some best practices you've seen that have helped governments overcome those delays even slightly? It's a really good question. And how might that be different? I'll add another layer to that. What do you do to help overcome some of those delays, and how does that differ from how you might address the same issue when you were in the private sector?
Thank you. That's a great question. I would push back just a little bit. I'd say they don't necessarily have to run slower than they do in the private sector. The biggest challenge is just making sure you're really clear on what the steps are you need to follow. And there are a few more steps, particularly in the procurement side, for those of us doing things in the government space. But if you know what those steps are, once you know what those steps are, you can build them into your project plan so that it's not really slowing down your project plan. It's just things you have to do, just like any other step in the project. Make sure you get it done on time, within your time budget. I think there are things you can do, such as paying attention to things like organizational change management. If you can get in front of that, that will pay back huge dividends in terms of lowering the organizational resistance to changing business processes. It will smooth out the adoption curves. It will give you a quicker ramp up to full utilization of a major investment for most organizations. These are not cheap systems to do. But by doing that, now you can get the questions from the people who are actually going to be hands on the keyboard entering data into the system. You can get their questions, their concerns quicker through the organizational change management process. Incorporate that into your training efforts prior to go live and post go live. You can address any questions during the project so that they don't come up to the day before go live. It's like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't like this. I don't like that. Build that into your process so that you don't end up in those kinds of situations. It really just comes down to, I think, understanding the steps that are different that you have to do, building those into your project plan, and then staying as connected to the organization as you can, and understanding where they are, for lack of a better word, mentally are they ready? Are they worried? Are they, where are they in their process of adopting this change? Because at the end of the day, if you're dealing with people, money, or assets for your organization, you're going to be touched by an ERP system, even if all you do is get a paycheck. That's a pretty important thing for most of us. But you want to make sure that process is not overly complex and overly stress-inducing, for lack of a better way of saying it, to the whole organization.
I'm here with Ron Puccinelli. We're talking about some of the lessons learned from government ERP and IT projects. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I don't mind letting you down easy, but just give it time. If it don't hurt now, but just wait.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
I want to invite you to join me and other thought leaders in the digital transformation space to Stratosphere 2025. It's an annual conference we've hosted now for 7 years in a row. It's a great event. It's live in Denver, Colorado, but we're also offering it virtually via hybrid tickets. And we're going to have a lot of different speakers here, including myself as a keynote, as well as others that you may know from the industry. And this is a perfect conference if you're interested in any sort of digital transformation, including ERP and CRM and HCM. And actually, the theme for this year's session is AI and how AI is affecting all different types of digital transformation. But in addition to AI, we'll also talk about the fundamentals of digital transformation, including program management, evaluating the right software, digital strategy, change management, process improvement, all the things you need to know to make your project successful. It's also a great way to network and learn from others. So just being part of a community that is also like-minded and going through the same things you are, that's another value. And you can join, like I said, remotely, in person, and you can also buy VIP tickets if you'd like more exclusive access to me and others from the Third Stage team and other speakers that are going to be there. So I hope to see you soon. Check out my discount code below for discounted tickets. You can go to stratosphere2025.com for more information, including the full agenda, and I hope to see you there. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 228. This is the special government digital transformation episode. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And I also encourage you, before we turn things back over to Ron, I also encourage you to download our guide to government digital transformation. Use the QR code here on the screen, or you can go to the links below. It's packed full of information on how to make your government IT or ERP or digital transformation efforts more successful. Totally tech agnostic. It contains a number of lessons learned, independent software reviews and rankings, all kinds of stuff that's meant to help you through your journey. So be sure to check that out. So shifting gears, we want to get back to this conversation here with Ron. We're in the midst of the conversation talking about some of the lessons from his experience as a government CIO. And here's a comment from Paul on LinkedIn. Paul says, IT said this is how we should do it, quote unquote, is spot on. The business case needs of each work group needs to be addressed in ERP planning and rollout. They are the customers. This is especially true in government. So great.
Absolutely true. It's not a lot less important in the private sector, but it's very, very true in the government space. And that's why with ERP projects and even other large scale tech-enabled projects that I work with, I partner with my internal clients, departments, 1, 2, whatever the number is, so that when we're pitching it, when we're reporting on our progress to the decision makers, to the constituents, to whomever it might be, my business partners are saying, this is the value we're getting out of it. I'm there saying, this is where we are in the implementation and the technology side of it. Because at the end of the day, if all you're doing is looking at the technology side of a project, you're never going to find the value. All you find is the expense and the cost. It's just the nature of what we do. But we want to make sure we have the other side of that, the business value of, and our business department saying, we see value in this. This is the value we're getting out of it, and communicating that out together as the team.
Yeah. Now, one comment that came up in, I think it was Paul, right? Was that his name? Sorry. Yes, Paul. So Paul, in his comment, alluded to business case, which is kind of an interesting comment or thought when it comes to public sector organizations. In the private sector, when you do a business case, there's labor efficiencies you're going to gain. You can increase revenue. You can reduce your inventory. If you're a manufacturer, you can speed up your manufacturing time. There's all these pretty clear, tangible business case benefits line items that are not always guaranteed, but they're easier to identify in some cases. What does a business case look like in the public sector? How is it different? Is it financially quantifiable in the same way? Do you see the same type of ROI that you might see in the private sector, or what are your thoughts there?
From the labor perspective, from the business efficiency side of things, it's very, very similar. You're going to save X amount of time in this process, X amount of time in that process. The challenge is, unfortunately, government tends to be less adept at measuring that. So it becomes a little squishier, but it can be done. It absolutely can be done. And in a business case, should look very much from the government side like it does on the private sector side. Yet we're not manufacturing, so we're not going to have, supply chains of, parts and manufactured inventory sitting there that we have to account for. But we do have things like lots of fleets in our, the public works road crews. They have some pretty expensive equipment. The streets themselves are assets that GASB, Governmental Accounting Standards Board, says we have to put on our books, and we have to track and maintain and take care of that over the life of the asset. That's something the private side doesn't have to worry about, but our system needs to be able to take care of that. So those kinds of things can be very, very, very similar, assuming your organization is able to and willing to do the actual measurements. If not, then it becomes a little bit softer, squishier, if I can use that word. It might not be as, we're going to save 3 staff hours per task on this. It might be, this will make us more efficient. We think we can get, based on some quick sampling, we think we can take 3 steps out of this process and get it done 10% faster. Those are still valid numbers. Conversely, just like on the private sector side, once you've made the investment, you want to follow up and see, are we getting what we thought we were going to get? It's one thing to say we're going to get all of this benefit, but if we don't go back and measure it and say, did we, then you've done half of it, but you haven't proved that this was the best thing to do. Again, it can be more challenging. A lot of it depends on the culture of the organization. Some organizations are not used to doing that for any of their projects, so they're not going to want to do it for an ERP type project. You just have to fit that in, but you can still come back at the end of the implementation and maybe a year later and report back to your budget team, your governing board, whatever that might be, and say, we spent a lot of money. We did this a year ago. This is how it's made us better, faster, cheaper than we used to be.
Yeah, great point. So it's maybe more common than you might think, in terms of the similarities with creating a business case. It's just more a matter of, can you make those squishy, some of those squishy benefits, can you make them a little more tangible and at least be directionally accurate in terms of what the improvements might be.
And that's where partnering with, again, the finance team and the HR team, they're the ones that are in it all day long. They can help you with labor costs and things like that.
Right. Well, we have the award for most random question so far in the stream is on YouTube. This is from someone on YouTube that says, "Do you believe in aliens?" And I thought, well, since you work for the government, maybe you know something that we don't, Ron. Would tell us the real story about aliens. What's this Area 51 thing that we should be thinking about?
I don't know about Area 51. I work for a city, not the federal government.
Right, it's true.
But personally, I happen to believe that aliens are real.
Yeah. I mean, you figure, I know we're way off topic here, and that's my fault, but actually I'll blame the person on YouTube that asked the question, but you think, with an infinite universe, there has to be life on another planet somewhere.
There has to be. Yeah. It may not be humanoid, but there's something somewhere.
I mean, I'd love to ask the audience, since we're off topic, drop in the chat. Do aliens exist? Does the government know about it? Maybe Ron knows about it, and he's acting innocent because he works for the city, not the federal government, but kidding aside, the real question I was going to ask you, though, now that I got myself completely sidetracked, this is actually a really interesting question, because I feel like we were just talking about this right before we went live. Ron and I were talking about some of the trials and tribulations of finding his next CIO role, and just sort of what he's looking for and that sort of thing. And this, you might have some strong opinions on this. This is from Jeremy on LinkedIn. Jeremy says, what 3 things would cause you to walk away from running a technology project in government? So if you were, especially now, as you're looking at these different organizations, you might become the next CIO or leader of, what are the things that would scare you away? Maybe some of them already have scared you away. I don't know. But what are 3 things some examples of things you might see or red flags you might observe that you want to that might tell you that, hey, I don't want to be part of this. I don't think it's going to be successful.
Great question. For me, it comes down to basic, the project management body of knowledge is if you're having a difficulty getting traction, if you don't have an engaged sponsor, if requirements are continuously changing throughout the life of a project, you have a lot of staff turnover, particularly at senior level, executive level type positions. Those are all things that would tend to say, maybe we need to pump the brakes on this. Maybe we need to reevaluate. I would say if you're coming into a project, you've got these typically run 18 to 24 months. If you're coming up on month 26, 28, and you still haven't gone live with at least part of your system, why are we spending more money on something that looks like it's never going to finish? Let's understand what finished looks like. You should do that up front, of course. But let's make sure we all agree on what finished looks like, and let's get to where we're using the system before we start spending more money on refining. And otherwise, you just end up chasing your tail and you never actually get anywhere.
Right.
I think those are the main things is if the requirements continue to change or they're not clear, you're having a huge amount of turnover, particularly at the executive level, your sponsor level. Those are some of the flags that would say, this might not be the right time to do this. The other piece I would say is prior to solicitation, and you're looking at your technical environment. If your technical environment can't deliver the features and functionality, the speeds, the system capacities that you need to do this project, make sure you have your technical foundation solid before you try and build on top of that. It's kind of like trying to hang curtains on windows that the foundation hasn't been built for yet.
Right. It's good. It's a good analogy or metaphor. That's a great point. Here's a comment from Joe on YouTube. Bro spitting facts. I have 2 teenage boys, and so I know enough to know that that's a compliment. So, bro, you're spitting facts around. I don't know about you, but I love people.
Thank you.
I love when people call me bro. Like I feel so young, like, oh wow, I'm bro really. Yep. That's cool. Here's a question from Troy, just building on this whole business case thread that we were just talking about. So Troy on LinkedIn says, related to the question about tracking metrics in the government sector versus private sector, what metrics are most important to you? Which ones are you tracking the most throughout a project?
Excellent question. And oddly enough, they're very, very similar, whether you're in the government side or in the private side, at least in my experience. We're tracking things like, are we on time to our project plan? Do we have the engagement from the project team, from the sponsor team? Are we delivering the value that we expected to deliver? And that comes back to your business case. Why are we doing this? Where are we in getting towards getting that done? And then at the end, after the implementation, did we meet those objectives of value that we thought we were going to get? It's never going to be 100% because just like, budgets or any other sort of strategic planning activity, it's your best guess about what's going to be in the future. And unfortunately, most of us don't know what the future looks like. So we say we think it's going to be a 10% savings reduction. After implementation, if we got 8%, we can say, hey, that's not too bad. If it's 2%, then we need to do a little bit more work on getting what we thought we were going to get.
Yeah, super, super interesting. Now, one thing I didn't ask you earlier that I probably should have asked you sooner is just when you look at your last 2 projects at City of Fairfield and City of Menifee in California, what system or systems were you deploying in those 2 cases?
In both of those cases, we went through our selection process, we ended up going with Tyler Technologies' government-specific ERP system. Both of those cities are relatively small. We're not a San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York or something like that would use an SAP or a PeopleSoft or your larger systems. I've done those systems in government as well as private, but those ones we ended up going with with the Tyler Technologies one, just because it was really much more focused on government. In the case of Menifee, we were actually using an older version of their product, so it was a little bit lower learning curve. Not completely flat, but lower. It's just how the selection process and the people that were going to be using it all day, every day, decided that's the one that was going to be the easiest for them to adopt.
Yeah. Industry specific systems can't be overlooked. There's a lot of good options out there aside from the big household name software vendors. There's a lot of industry niche players that focus on specific needs in industries. Yeah.
Right.
So when you were going through that project, what would you say in those two cases of implementing Tyler Technologies at both City of Menifee and City of Fairfield? What were some of the biggest challenges you faced there that you thought were the hardest part of doing that implementation?
I hate to say this, but in some cases, working with the vendor is the bigger challenge. Not because they can't do it; they absolutely can. But in this particular case, Tyler, they are both the system manufacturer, for lack of a better word, as well as the implementation team. They do not allow third-party implementers. So that's both good and bad. They tend to know the system really well because they wrote the system. The potential downside of that is because they have like 60 or 70% of the government market across the United States, at least. Because of that, their implementation teams are very busy. So you will tend to see a little bit of, you might start with person A in chart of accounts and end up going through person B and C and D in the life of your project. You want to try and minimize that as much as you can, but again, depending on the constraints of your implementing team from the vendor, you might not be able to completely eliminate all of that. I think the other big challenge is remembering that, and this is true regardless of who you go with, the implementations team's focus is on getting to implementation complete. They're not worrying about, do you have time to train your people? Are you taking enough time to make the decisions in the most strategic way about your chart of accounts, about your process re-engineering, those kinds of things? That still is something that the internal implementation team needs to build into the overall project plan. I would push back a bit and say, yes, the vendor team needs to come up with their project plan, but you still need to put your specific steps and things into the overall project plan. And it might be where, okay, vendor, your team's going to be done in 6 months. We need to add 2 months for our work to get the chart of accounts straight, to do our process reviews and make sure we've not got steps we don't need, or we're adding another process. So we need you to go a little bit slower while we take the right amount of time to get that done.
Right. Yeah. Great point. Here's an interesting question from Perry, or it's actually a comment, but I want to see what you think of this comment, Ron. So Perry on LinkedIn says, I think that any government major technology project needs to go through a business process discovery, re-engineering, enterprise architecture, not just tech architecture, to simplify and automate some of the processes before engaging with an ERP evaluation. Is this true, or have you seen this to be true?
It's absolutely true.
Wait, how have you addressed that?
Yes. So in City of Fairfield, up here in the Bay Area, we actually did that. We intentionally sat down and went through all of our business processes before we even signed the contract with the vendor, and said, are there things how do we make this process better, regardless of which system we're using? How do we make the process itself better? That is super critical. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to be, to use an old Gartner term, you don't want to be paving the cow path. You want to be engineering the freeway, to reduce friction, to make things flow as fast and as smoothly and as appropriately as they can. You don't want to give up any of your authorization steps that are required or important to you, but you don't want it to slow down and, go back and forth and back and forth. Anecdotally, I can tell you that in some of these reviews, we find things like, well, this one piece of paper needs to go from the first floor to the second floor to the fifth floor to the ninth floor, back to the first floor. And it makes that loop 3 times and only one person signs it. Nobody does anything with it otherwise. Well, why are we doing all that? Let's just have the one person get what they need. Right. Those kinds of things have nothing to do with your system, but they add delay, they add friction to your business processes. And again, that's getting back to, we want to engineer the most streamlined, efficient process and then automate it, as opposed to just automating a bad process.
Yeah. And that gets overlooked a lot. I think people think that they have to find and deploy the new technology before they can improve their processes. And so many of the process improvements are not necessarily just technology related. A lot of times it's just, you got a kludgy broken process because it's sort of just morphed into this mess of a process that if you just clean it up and, sort of streamline it using what you've got, there's a lot of value you can get in the short term. And it also, from a change management perspective, it sort of incrementally introduces change slowly instead of all at once. One big massive change. It allows you to sort of incrementally adjust to some of these improvements along the way.
Right.
I want to come back to what you're saying. You were talking about Tyler Technologies a moment ago, and I forgot to mention this when you were talking about how you had deployed Tyler Technologies in both cases, at City of Menifee and City of Fairfield. But the interesting thing about Tyler Technologies that I think a lot of times people forget about too is a lot of times you think, well, I can either go with a big name ERP system like SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, whatever, or I could go with a niche industry player like a Tyler Technologies, or in most industry verticals that we consult to, there's a lot of different industry players that build solutions just for their individual niche. But the interesting thing about products like Tyler Technologies is that they're sort of like a hybrid of both. They're built on the Microsoft Dynamics platform, but it's very much tailored for the government space. So it's not like you're dealing. So you were talking about how you had to deal with Tyler Technologies because they're the publisher of the software, and they are, but at the same time, it's also built on the Microsoft platform, and so you're getting some of the benefit and some of the the advantages of being part of that Microsoft ecosystem. And it's not just Microsoft. I know Salesforce does the same thing. They open up their platform to third-party developers to do stuff like that. So the reason I bring all this up is that if you're in government, of course, there's Tyler Technologies. There's other systems out there you could look at that might fit your needs specifically. But in other industries too, there's a lot of Microsoft partners, Salesforce partners, even NetSuite is starting to do it, where you've got third-party developers that are creating these very specific solutions on an existing platform. So be sure to look at those hybrid options, I guess is my point there, because there are a lot of good ones out there.
Absolutely. There's no silver bullet that says this is the only way you should do it. You got to find what works best for you in your business and your industry.
Absolutely. Although I will say in the government space, I think, I don't have the data in front of me, but I believe Tyler Technologies is the most common one that we've seen, especially at the city and county level. Once you get up to
in the United States, that's
good point. In the United States, yes. And then, at the federal level in the United States, that's different. Usually that's where you're going to see more of the, the bigger players like SAP and Oracle, Workday as well. When you look at the projects you've been through, what's the biggest takeaway or not mistake necessarily? I mean, there's a lot of mistakes to be made in these projects, but what's the biggest mistake or biggest lesson that you've learned from doing these implementations, whether it's for Menifee or Fairfield or in the private sector as well?
As odd as it sounds, I think one thing to remember is no plan ever survives first contact with the enemy, in this case, the project. Don't stress on it. Let it, it's going to do what it's going to do. You got to be nimble on your feet. You got to adapt to the changes in the organization, because these are long-term kinds of projects. They're not something you do in a week or two. They're a year and a half, 2, even 3 years long. And you want to be able to adapt the project to the changes in the organization. Nothing's going to be perfectly smooth. You're going to come out of it with some battle scars at the end of the day. The trick is to make sure, to the best of your ability, none of them are fatal. But lessons are going to be learned. And I would say build that into various stages in your project plan as well. Don't be afraid of that, particularly if you're on, for lack of a better word, the steering committee part of the project. You want to make sure that periodically you're taking that look back and saying, where are we running into problems? What can we do to move that out? You got to make that feedback loop happen continuously. But at the end of the day, you don't want to leave dead bodies by the side of the road by burning out your teams. But you also don't want to let the project get derailed and fail. You got to find that balance in between. And it's going to be work. These things are a huge amount of work, a huge amount of change. You just have to be ready to do it.
Absolutely. Just to circle back on the alien thread, Perry on LinkedIn says that we are the aliens on Earth. So I think we've settled the whole are there aliens or do you believe in aliens? Maybe we've settled that whole debate, but I'm guessing probably not. Another quick question. I won't dive too far into this, but I do want to address it. This is from Vast CNC on YouTube. Vast says, where does Palantir enter the picture? LOL. So it's a joke, but actually Palantir is something that's used quite a bit for bigger federal and countrywide government institutions, not only in the US, but it's internationally as well. So Palantir is sort of a middleware BI AI workflow engine that sort of sits on top of legacy systems. So you can get some of the best, some of the best of both worlds, if you will, without having to necessarily replace your back office ERP systems. But the question I want to ask you, just to sort of close out and bring this all full circle now we're on, is what advice would you give to other city CIOs or government leaders or any ERP implementation project leader, even in the private sector? What advice would you give for those leaders that are preparing for an ERP implementation?
Pack your patience.
Yep.
If I could just touch on the Palantir piece for a moment, part of what you want to do in an ERP system is recognize that it's not going to do everything that your business does. You're going to need those middleware integration points. Make sure you know what those are up front. Even if you're not doing anything with it, just make sure you know what it is you're going to need to do down the road so that you can build that into your system requirements and into your system. I would say if you're an organization looking at considering doing an ERP implementation or even just a more general digital changeover in your business processes, don't forget to do the important work of defining what is the reason we're doing this. What's the business reason we're doing this? If that's not clear, it's going to be a struggle to get success. Build in time for your organization to understand, to do the organizational change management, for them to understand the what, the why, the how, and as much as you possibly can, get them engaged in defining the how, through your project teams, through your implementation teams, through your training processes. Build in as much of that feedback as you can on, they're the ones doing the work. They know best what they need. Let them help you define and drive all of that. The other thing I would suggest is periodically build in a report back to your governing board. In city cases, it's the city council or the board of supervisors if you're at county level, your board of directors if you're in the private side. Build back a periodic, here's where we are, here are the next things that are happening. We found problems, we've not found problems. Finally, the last thing I think I would add in there is we want to make sure that while we're staying in budget, this is kind of like remodeling a house. You never know what's in the walls until you open them up. You want to build in some contingency in your budgets to handle any of those surprises. Don't use it all in the first 2 weeks of the project either, but you want to be able to handle whatever surprises you find in the process.
Great advice, and surprises are a necessary evil in these sorts of projects, and there's a lot you can do to minimize the amount of surprises you have. But, like you said, you talked earlier about doing some of that upfront work to define, the way your processes are going to work and that sort of thing. There's a lot of phase zero planning type stuff you can do to mitigate risk. Obviously, choosing the right technology or technologies that mitigates your risk, but you're never going to fully mitigate or eliminate the surprises in these projects. And so, knowing that you've got some buffer in there is important. So it's really important too not to fall victim to the false hope that I'm using a commercial off the shelf system with best practices. How hard can it be? Or another one we hear a lot is like a lot of CIOs, a lot of executives, especially like CFOs and COOs, people more from the business side. A lot of them will say, well, change isn't going to be that hard because people hate the systems we have. So they're going to love the new system. And yeah, that's might be true. But once you dig in and start screwing up people's jobs and changing it and moving stuff around, it's that who moved my cheese, concept. That's where people start to feel a lot more threatened. All right, great stuff. Thanks, Ron. I appreciate having him on the show. Even though we recorded that over 2 segments, we had the initial panel interview that was today. The interview I just showed you was from a few weeks ago, but that's a lot of information he shared in a couple hours of discussion that he's been involved with. So really appreciate his contributions here. Great guy, a repeat client of ours. Love having him on the show as well. So that's what we've got for you today. I hope this has given you some stuff to chew on and think about and get the wheels turning. And again, I encourage you to share this episode with your team if you're going through a project like this. And if you want to brainstorm ideas about your government project, feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. I'm happy to have just an informal conversation with you to bounce around ideas and sort of compare notes on what it is you're doing, and maybe give you some pointers on how to get started or how to pivot if you're already in the middle of your project. And I also encourage you to download our guide to government digital transformation. You can find that in the QR code right here, actually. And actually in editing, I guess I'll put it wherever I point. So how about this? I'll point right here. We'll put the QR code right here to download the government digital transformation report. And be sure to check that out. It's a free resource on our website. And if you'd like to learn more about us at Third Stage, we're an independent tech agnostic consulting firm. We help government entities throughout the world through their digital transformations. We have several clients right now in the U.S. at the city and county level, and some emerging states that we're starting to work with as well. And so, and we've done work with international governments as well. So if you're in the midst of any sort of government IT or digital transformation or ERP initiative, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to have our government team chat with you and myself chat with you to chat about your project. So hope you found this information useful. Hope you have a great day, and we hope to see you next time on the next episode of Transformation Ground Control.